Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. It's exciting to be back after a little break. I hope everybody's enjoying their summers, and whoever goes to cognitive science, whether you're watching us now or later, we hope that you enjoyed the session. Okay, so today we're extremely excited to have Dr. David Badre of Brown University. Before we introduce David, let me remind everyone that this is the Learning Salon. We were weekly, although with some breaks in between, forum on discussing contentions and bridges between biological and artificial learning. We have a very interdisciplinary audience, as you all know. So please don't feel bad about asking any questions. We have people from philosophy, from neuroscience, from psychology, from computer science, from AI, from ML, from linguistics. Apologies if I didn't mention your discipline, but do ask your questions for clarification in the chat if you want, and people can reply on it if and somebody else knows. And if you have questions to the speaker, please put it in the ask a question area below, and don't be shy about it. Especially we encourage students and junior scientists and researchers to ask questions, because this is a place to practice question asking and discussing. In the ask a question area, just click it and vote on each other's questions, and people with more votes or some questions that are related to certain times, we might invite them on the screen. So if you don't want to be on screen, just mention ask for me so that we don't bother you, but we would really appreciate if you join the screen when you're asking your question. Another thing, as always, is to be respectful to each other. As you know, conversations and discussions and debate can get heated sometimes, and that's totally okay. It's better to disagree than politely refrain to mention disagreements when we are in science, because the goal is to understand each other. But even if you disagree with someone, our goal here is understanding. So it's okay to disagree with someone, but with respect and attempt to understand their perspective. And then it's okay to disagree, just to be clear. So when we say respect, we don't mean don't disagree. We just mean try to understand the other person as much as you can, instead of thinking about just expressing disagreement as fast as possible. Okay, with that, I would say, John, did you want to introduce David?
Oh my gosh. Sure. I mean, we're not big on just spouting people's credentials, David, and so
that's fine. You can say, "Here's David."
No. Well, I think what we'll start with, though, is you're obviously, is it David Better or David Badre? Let's get your name absolutely right.
Okay? So David Better.
David Better. Okay.
Spelling, it's a French transliteration of a Lebanese name. So
yeah, I read that. Better. Okay. That's a good name to have, isn't it?
It's better than mine.
Okay, so David Better is a professor of cognitive science at Brown University. He has done a lot of work both at the behavioral level and the imaging level on cognitive control, which I think many people would in the past may have called executive function. I think they're fairly synonymous. This is an area that is of great interest because it sort of falls, as David says in his book, between, it's the processes between knowledge and action. In other words, getting things done, being on task. And it's very, very important to be able to have scientists bring formal rigor to patients, for example, with prefrontal damage that I've seen many, many, many of in my career, where one finds oneself baffled, right? Because it doesn't quite fit into, on the one hand, dementias on the one side and sensory motor disorders on the other. It's this glue in between that really requires some ingenuity experimentally to get a handle on, which I think David has really been exemplary at doing. And we're very excited. I think, David, you are correct me as always, you're our fourth or fifth guest who has come in the context of a book that they've recently written, which I think is always really exciting. And just my last point about that is, and we'd love to hear maybe the first question from you, is the importance of writing books. right, and reading them.
Definitely.
And that these trade books, which fall between being a monograph and being a popular science book, but actually represent a synthesis from a scientist who's been doing this work, I think it's a really useful scientific object. And I think that we underplay the importance of writing or reading books by scientists who are in a field.
I entirely agree. It's great to do as a scientist, by the way. I mean, it's just you're licensed to read and broadly and in depth and in ways that, and think about this stuff that other venues we have for doing our work really doesn't allow. So
what we like to think the Learning Salon has done here is done two things which we don't get enough of. One is books and writers in science, and the other one is extended conversations on topics. And so I think these are gaps that paradoxically are the intellectually richest and yet don't seem to have time, maybe because, as I've said before, we're just not asked to be slow and deep in a world that's fast and shallow.
I like that. All right, so
the book is called Untask, and if anybody wants to take
I have the hardback.
Oh, nice. I love this color. Teal is one of my favorite colors.
No, I actually think that I agree. That's nice color-wise. Yeah.
And my bookshelf is color organized, and the teal section is a small section, so it really stands out. Okay, so just you can share your screen, and we will listen to you, and everyone will ask their questions. For prefrontal cortex aficionados, for task set aficionados, as you know, David is one of our heroes, so very excited to hear the talk.
All right, can you see my slide?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to talk probably 15 minutes or so. This is just really to give an overview of the book. The book is pretty broad in its scope, so I'm not going to hope to cover all the topics here. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of some of the basic arguments at a high level, and kind of the scope of the book, and hopefully that'll just be a seed for the discussion, actually. So I want to thank you again for inviting me. I'm really excited to come and have a conversation in this forum, and particularly about this topic, which is one that I enjoy. So just to start, I'm going to start with an example. This is not an example that's actually in the book, but I think it illustrates one of the kind of main themes in the book really well. So this is a figure that comes from the Complexity Science Hub's COVID-19 strategies list, kind of set of data visualizations. And what it shows is the timeline by which different governments around the world, and the governments are in, can you see my cursor? Okay, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So the government, different countries are sort of in the rows here, and the timeline is in the x-axis, is sort of all of the months in 2020. And the little color coding are the different kinds of COVID strategies, mitigation strategies that these are policies these governments put in place. So, the red one, for instance, is social distancing and so forth. And the diameter of these is how many there are and so forth. It's interesting to kind of spend some time with. But at a really high level, why I find this to be very interesting is you can really appreciate, if you kind of back out and just look at the figure, maybe blur your eyes a little bit, is that in March of 2020, right, the whole world underwent radical behavior change. Like we all started basically in a matter of weeks in that month, we all started doing lots of things differently. A lot of countries went into lockdown. We were working differently. We were going to school differently. We were grocery shopping differently. We had new rituals like washing our groceries and antiseptic wipes and things. So all of that was happening, and we did it without thousands of trials of training, right? We did it without obviously years of evolution, right? It was done in a relatively short time span of days or weeks, and we were doing behaviors we'd never done before, and it was coordinated like around the world in response to this very unusual event. And that's a really important human capacity. It's something that we can do. That we can take abstract rules and concepts, things we were told by authorities that we might trust, or a government that we're obliged to follow, and we follow those rules even though we've never done them before. Okay, and doing that is actually very challenging. And so psychologists think that ability is underwritten by this capacity called cognitive control. All right, and so cognitive control and that's the main topic of the book. Now, cognitive control has been notoriously difficult to define over the years for scientists, and so no definition is entirely perfect. But here's one definition. It refers to a class of mechanisms, in other words, not just one thing, that allow us to use our goals, our rules and plans and norms and things that we know about the world, right, and use those in order to select, influence, organize, and monitor what we do, our actions. And so the way that, and John in his intro, I thought, referred to this quite appropriately. In the book, the way I refer to this then is cognitive control is this linking operation or processes that allow us to connect what we know with how we behave. And they're often, we make assumptions about there being a direct line between what we know and how we behave. But the reality is we need processes like cognitive control to make that link. And so the book is really about those kind of how we make those linkages and all of the different facets. Now, the book is also about the brain, and so I focus on, in particular, the prefrontal cortex, because that's a part of the brain which, for those who don't study anatomy, is this very frontal part of the frontal lobe, sort of redundantly named prefrontal cortex, right? And that part of the brain has long been associated with cognitive control functions. Now, I should note that we now know that that there are full networks, right, that include the prefrontal cortex, but also include populations of neurons in other parts of the brain and other areas, particularly association cortex. And in fact, there are multiple such networks. And there are subcortical structures that all interact dynamically to support control. But prefrontal cortex is a major player here. And kind of along with the mystery of cognitive control, there's been the mystery and puzzle of the prefrontal cortex and its function. But the reason why we've long associated, or one reason why we've long associated prefrontal cortex with cognitive control function, is that the observation that damage or disease that affects that part of the brain seems to impact our ability to get things done, right, in order to connect our knowledge and action. Okay, and as John mentioned, these patients are really perplexing, and they really puzzled neurologists for a number of years. And I give lots of examples of these kinds of cases in the book, but I'll give you one example here, right? So this is the case of EVR, who was reported by Eslinger and Damasio in 1985. So EVR was an accountant by trade. He's 44 years old, and he had a frontal tumor resection bilaterally. And so here's a sort of a reconstruction of the tissue that was removed. Just to orient you, these are what are called axial slices. So they're slices. I don't know if you can see me, but they're slices like this and through the head, and it's going from the bottom to the top of the head here. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain, and the sort of dark area that's shaded here is the tissue that's removed. And the important thing to appreciate here is it's not just that the prefrontal cortex has been parts of the prefrontal cortex have been resected, but is a large amount of tissue that's been removed in this patient. But nonetheless, EVR did really well on the kinds of assessments that neuropsychologists use in the clinic to assess cognitive function, including the kinds of functions that are tests we'd use to assess cognitive control. Things, for instance, EVR was in the superlative range on IQ tests like the WAIS. And so that's not uncommon for these patients with frontal lobe damage. They really present very well with the kinds of experiments and tests that one does in the clinic. But outside of the clinic, and this is the puzzle, right? It was a different matter. His life had really kind of fell apart after that, after his brain damage. He had risen to the level of comptroller, a position of some responsibility in this accounting firm he worked at. After his brain damage, he lost his job due to frequently being late. He lost his life savings in some risky business schemes. His wife of many years left him with their kids. He was divorced, then got remarried, then got divorced, then got remarried again, all over a short period of time. And so across multiple different ways of looking at EVR's life, it's sort of his ability to kind of pursue stable relationships, stable jobs, and so forth was reduced. And it was also evident in his day-to-day life. He could discuss things he wanted to do, like he wanted to go, for instance, to a restaurant that evening, but then he would rarely follow through on that. And not because, again, he lost the motivation. He would just spin forever in the planning stages or maybe making rehearsal runs and then getting distracted and coming back and so forth. And so he was just unable to complete the goals that he had in mind. And so overall, across, from moment to moment and across multiple tasks, he was ineffective at getting things done. And this is this kind of, this is what makes cognitive control so challenging to study as a science, is there's something there that is clearly disruptive for these patients, but it's very hard to put your hand around what exactly has been lost here. What is the specific process, particularly in light of how they do on our standard kinds of tests. But one thing that isn't lost is that this isn't a motor deficit in the most simplest way of describing that, in terms of, say, a loss of motor skill. And that's demonstrated in a number of ways, but one is in the kind of dramatic case of so-called environmental dependency syndrome. And this was a series of cases. I'll give an example from a Dr. Lermite in 1986. So this is one of Lermite's cases. This woman was a nurse, and by her profession, before her brain damage. And Lermite gave her a blood pressure apparatus, and then he kind of extended his arm. And upon seeing him extend his arm, she was compelled to go through all the complex steps she needed to do to take his blood pressure. Okay, so probably taking blood pressure is something this woman had done many, many, many times over the course of her career. She had built that skill, right, that set of actions, pretty in what we call an automatic way. It was very well learned. And seeing that arm extended sort of triggered that well-learned sequences of action. So the action itself is fine, it's intact. It's her ability to control when the appropriate time is to do it that's impaired, right? It's clear that Dr. Lermite doesn't need his blood pressure taken right now, and you don't just wrap a blood pressure apparatus around any old arm you see, right? There are contexts in which that's the appropriate thing to do. And in fact, if you asked her, right, is this the appropriate thing to do? She would probably be able to tell you that, no, I didn't need to take Dr. Lermite's blood pressure. She would have knowledge of the context and the situation that would allow her would tell her this is the right or not the right thing to do at this point in time. And this gets at this idea of this knowledge-action dissociation, right? That these patients can have intact action in the sense that they're able to carry out various types of tasks, and they have knowledge in the sense they understand when they should do things, but they're unable to connect these two things, use the knowledge they have about the situation to constrain or affect how they behave. And one more example of this, this comes from a set of cases by Frank Benson, who was a behavioral neurologist. So while evaluating for the presence of diabetes insipidus, the patient was instructed, don't drink any water, don't go near the water fountain. Within a few minutes, he was observed having a drink at the water fountain. When asked by the examiner what he'd just been told, he immediately replied, don't drink any water, don't go near the water fountain. So here the patient's able to verbatim repeat the instruction that he was given, right? But because he lacks this control function, he's unable to use that to sort of withhold this compulsion he has to go and drink at the water fountain. And if this interaction is familiar, a point that I also raised in the book, then it would be familiar to you if you, for instance, have small children, because as a parent, you have these interactions a lot, right? Like you say, don't go near that outlet, and they go over and touch the outlet, and you're like, what did I just say? And then they say, oh, don't go near the outlet. And we often interpret that as sort of rebellion or pushing boundaries on the part of a child. But it could also be that they have a developing control system, and they're learning how to take that or sort of abstract rule, seemingly arbitrary rule you gave them, and use it to stop this temptation to put their finger in that hole in the wall that you told them not to do. Okay, so cognitive control then allows us to connect our knowledge and our action. Now, a point I emphasize in the book, and might be a point of discussion today, is that action in this case is also importantly both compositional and generative. And what I mean by that is that a theory about control has to explain how it is that we can represent a task in terms of its constituent parts, and such that those parts, we can take useful bits of one task and we can kind of pull them out and reconstruct them and rearrange them to build new tasks. In fact, novel tasks that we've never done before. And that seems to be an important property of human behavior, and it's something that cognitive control should contribute to. Now, on the knowledge side, that allows us then to implement knowledge based in a knowledge system that's kind of rich and scalable. It's abstract in the sense that we can draw inferences, we can engage in foresight and prediction, we can engage in counterfactual thinking and hypothetical thinking, and that's incredibly useful for inventing new potential outcomes and tasks that we might want to do in the future. And if you pair that with this generative action system that can then implement those tasks we've never done before, it's a very powerful combination. And those are sort of the two ingredients that I highlight that are at the basis of human flexible behavior and that are enabled by cognitive control. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of the book. And again, I'm just trying to give you a sweeping overview of the main points in the book. There's a lot more detail in there, but in general, at the beginning, I try to introduce cognitive control and this notion of compositional and generative action. In part two, I really delve much more into the mechanisms of control. Admittedly, this part of the book is probably the least trade booky part of the book, because I do go into some of the psychology and neuroscience that I think is important as a theoretical basis of control. And so I'm just going to, again, I don't have a lot of time today, so I'm going to just give you a little snapshot of that, and hopefully it won't be too vague. I'm happy to elaborate any of this moving forward. But just to make it a little bit clearer, to ground it in something concrete, I'll start with just what I'm defining as simple in scare quotes, because nothing's actually simple, but a simple act of control. Right. So these two pictures are both of my foyer in my house here in Providence, Rhode Island. Okay, but there's a really important difference between these two pictures. It's not that the lighting's a little different or something like that. The one on the left was taken before May 8th, 2020. And the one on the right was taken after May 8th, 2020. And why that's really important is that on May 8th, 2020, Rhode Island passed its mask mandate. So before that time, when I was in this context, right, I could sort of enact my routine for leaving the house. But after May 8th, the same exact context would present itself, but now I had to incorporate my mask, remembering to bring a mask and wear it and so forth as I leave the house. Okay, and this is sort of the basic idea or the problem you're dealing with control in a really simple way. You have the same inputs, right? The inputs that I'm sensing in the world are the same, but I have to take potential different actions based on that same input. And this is what would be a lot of trouble from a purely behaviorist perspective, right? There's no direct link between what I perceive in the world, the senses that are coming in, and my outputs or my responses. And so the way that a lot of people in cognitive control think about this is that we use some internal representation of a context, maybe in this case that there's a COVID pandemic and the relevant protocols, and I hold that in mind, and it can provide a top-down control signal that allows me to choose the appropriate action and not the inappropriate one. And now, so important to that is that I have to have some way of holding that information. And so I emphasize in the book the role of working memory, or a small capacity limited memory system for holding task relevant information. But here it's really important for holding information that can act as a control signal, okay, within working memory. And further, we think that the prefrontal cortex is essential for supporting that working memory function for those kinds of control signals. Now, there's one more piece here, right, at the functional level to highlight, and that is you need to have a control over working memory itself. Working memory isn't unbounded, it's capacity limited. And so for this, I describe these control processes on working memory that use a metaphor of a gate. Okay, and so there's an input gate to control what gets into working memory. And so that's important for putting in things that I need to act as a context into memory, like the rules for the COVID pandemic, and not things that are irrelevant. For instance, that as I'm leaving the house, my kids are playing Minecraft or something, that's irrelevant. So I would keep that out. And I can use the gate to input relevant things and keep out irrelevant things. And likewise, I also need to control what information in memory is allowed to influence my behavior and when in a dynamic world. And so an output gate is important for that. And so I argue in the book that getting the right gating policies, when to input gate, when to output gate, and what to input gate and what to output gate, is really how we translate sort of our general rules and goals into concrete control policies and actions, or it's an important part of that. I also, of course, get into the biology of this, and I don't have a lot of time to describe that now, but I'll just allude to it. I talk about this within a framework that was initially developed by my colleague and collaborator, Michael Frank, that proposes that these gates on memory are supported by interactions between the basal ganglia, between the cortex, as I've already described, in the frontal lobe, and the basal ganglia, which is these deep structures you can see here inside of the frontal lobe, okay, particularly the striatum. So these loops, right, for instance, as kind of drawn here, act as feedback loops that allow information or representations in the cortex that are relevant, that you should be enacted to be selected. They're sort of positive or negative feedback loops, but in their positive feedback loop, they can amplify relevant representations. And this has been better characterized in the motor domain for amplifying relevant motor actions. But those same loops, right, can also amplify neural representations in the prefrontal cortex, and that same then kind of servo mechanism can also select context representations for engaging in control. And again, and I realize that's a bit cryptic in how I'm describing it, but what's nice about this is it's a biological mechanism for engaging in this kind of production, or this kind of context-dependent selection of responses and contexts. And further, it's scalable. So I can deal with not just sort of simple contingencies, like there's some context that determines a set of action protocols, but for instance, even more complex, hierarchically arranged rules such that context determine how other contexts relate to behavior. Those can be addressed by just positing additional sort of corticostriatal loops that can interact with one another and address these more complex policies. And so it's nice, it's appealing in that it's scalable to the kinds of complex compositional action control we want. Okay, so that's the second part of the book. Armed with that, I go into the third part of the book, and I'm kind of out of time, so I'm just going to give you a quick view of what this covers. But sort of with that theoretical background, I cover a number of different facets of control. I talk about multitasking, not just that we're bad at it, but why we're bad at it and why we're sometimes even good at it. Right? We can't, after all, chew gum and walk at the same time. I discussed inhibition or stopping. I distinguished inhibition as sort of a description of behavior from inhibition as a process that actually stops other things. And I emphasize this kind of stopping inhibition as one such process and its relationship to these cortico-basal ganglia kinds of processes, though different loops than the ones I was just describing. I talk about the relationship between motivation and control, or value and control, and how value both modulates control so that we can control our behavior for outcomes that we value, that are desirable, and also how we balance that against the costs related to mental activity and mental effort. I discuss control of memory, and I do so within the framework of the information retrieval problem. So not just about about remembering, but the fact that we want to remember things that have utility, that are useful for what we're doing, and control plays an important part in shaping memory for that purpose. And finally, I discuss control as sort of a dynamic faculty over our lifespan, right? It's not static, but yet changes. It both matures over the course of our development, and it changes as we age. And I also discuss a bit attempts to intervene on control through things like training, and why that has been a less than successful effort so far, at least why I think so. Okay, so that's a general overview of the book. I'm happy at this point to discuss any of these topics in more detail and take questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
The art of précis. It's a lot to put together.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
So thank you so much. Obviously, that the short time that we had allotted your talk, it does not do justice to the richness of the book, especially I would say from chapter 4 onwards, the parts that you mentioned towards the end, the hierarchies in the head, and then the Tao of multitasking, which is such a great chapter title. And then you have much more but the costs and benefits of control. And I think that is, as we know, a lot of our friends just exclusively focus their entire research on that area. Cognitive control over lifespan, which you mentioned at the end. I think that, so I have been reading, obviously, your work since I was in grad school and citing your work about the prefrontal hierarchies and everything. I'm going to delve a lot into asking questions, but I want to make sure we start with John, because I think John is very good at keeping it at this level of bridges to other disciplines, and I might get to dive too deeply. And I feel like it might be more beneficial. And also I will collect the questions while John is asking the question.
Thanks, Ida. David, honestly, I'm feeling a little bit fluttery because there are so many things to discuss. But I think the way Ida divided it gives me my marching orders, actually. First of all, I kind of wanted to get you just to say one statement first. I mean, it's really interesting when you mentioned Benson and Luria and Lamite, and others that are more contemporary. I just would like to make a plug, and don't make me force you to say if you don't believe it, just how valuable still studying patients with lesions is to get insights into these problems, right? As you know, cognitive science has gone very much in the direction of imaging healthy subjects, recording from healthy macaques, but it just seems to me that a true, deep, initial insight into these things comes from these remarkable clinical examples. I was just wondering, what you think the state of studying interesting patients, managing to painstakingly observe them, and is this a dying art? I mean, or how do we keep it going? Because, these experiments are just these cases, I should say, are just so valuable.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, for me, in my training, so just a little bit of my background. So I did my graduate work with Anthony Wagner in a very kind of classical cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience tradition, laboratory experiments. And so my conception, in my discipline of control was, controller is things like, street tasks and rule-guided behavior, all of this, right? When I did my postdoc with Mark Desposito, and I learned a lot. It was a great way to approach that problem, right? But then I did my postdoc with Mark Desposito, and had the opportunity at that point to test patients and work with patients. And what was striking to me was how patients didn't fit easily into the kinds of clean ways that I was thinking about control up until that point, right? And it was that itself was a tremendous lesson as a scientist, right? I'm not a clinician, right? My obviously I want to do I would like my work to help patients and help these kinds of concerns, but also just as a even from the fundamental science perspective, it changes the way you think of things. And so that's got me interested in always kind of referencing patient work and learning about patients. And when you do that, you get a very different perspective on your science. And cognitive control is definably that way. I mean, it's very hard when you realize that a lot of the tasks that you're doing that you think you're studying you're studying cognitive control, right? When you're doing, how many papers are there on the Stroop task, for example, right? But then you realize a patient has no problem with that task. You have no problem with most of the tasks that we study, right, in the lab. And yet here you think this, and this is a person who you think would be the ground zero, would be the defining case of a problem with cognitive control, and yet they're fine on these kinds of tasks. That's very puzzling, right, as a scientist. And it makes you think, well, maybe we're not thinking about this exactly the right way. In my case, it ended up moving me towards thinking about, well, we need to then find scalable features, right? That's actually what got me moving down the hierarchy kind of line of work, right? Is what are the kinds of things we can scale, we can define the complexity in ways that would challenge a patient, and then try to understand it better that way. So we're not just studying the simple cases, we're also studying how to change those simple cases so that we can kind of inductively make inferences about the more complex case. In terms of it being art, I agree with you. I think it's unfortunate, but I think that is the case, right? We're seeing less and less of these kinds of case studies, at least brought to the attention of basic scientists, and that's a real loss.
And it's also interesting that the point you make about how it's until you insert the person into real life that's when they fall apart, right? And it's a little bit analogous to an article that I wrote with friends back in 2017 on behavior and neuroscience, saying that if you don't get ecological in the animal experiments, you're going to miss things too. And it's almost like this is a parallel that, in a way, to bring out some of these deficits, you have to have real life. Otherwise, you don't notice in the lab. And another example of that we've written about too is doing simple motor learning tasks in the lab that take minutes, hours, or maybe days to learn. It's a long way from the years and years and years it is to become an expert. So it seems like this lab real world distinction, whether clinical, animal scientific, or keeps emerging, right? And in other words, it's as though we just have to be super careful about what we mean when we take the computational models of the simple and see how they apply to the real world. I mean, it's extremely interesting. So I have two kinds of observations about your book that caused me cognitive dissonance, right? Not because of your stuff, but just, you call your book, On Task, and you very much make this nice case about the glue between knowledge and action. And then you give the wonderful example of EVR, where, you wouldn't really see a knowledge deficit, and to the degree that there were knowledge tasks, the patient did well, right? Okay. Then you take, John Duncan's book from, I don't know when it was written, but it was called How Intelligence Happens, which covers quite similar ground and actually begins by going through the examples of the frontal lobe patients. But the term in that book used is intelligence, okay, which comes up, I think, once or twice in your whole book, right? And I always think it's interesting when you read books to look at what is and is not in the index, okay? Let me tell you what doesn't show up in your index, okay? The word meaning never shows up once, right? Semantics never shows up once. Representation never shows up once. Thought and thinking don't show up, okay? So in other words, and I'll tell you why I'm bringing that up, right? Because if you take a look at other books that talk about the prefrontal cortex, they talk about thinking and reasoning, and inference doesn't show up in your index either, right? So, and yet, throughout the book, all these things are presupposed. And you actually mentioned even in your slides, abstraction, ideas, goals. Okay. So, and then you have books written by, for example, Jose Boggio on semantics in the left hemisphere. Whole book written on semantic representation in the left hemisphere. And then you have people like Richard Heyer, who's done a huge amount of work on frontal-parietal integration theory for intelligence. And in John Duncan's book, he talks about G for a third of the book, right? So you've got people talking about semantics, you've got people talking about knowledge, you've got people talking about reasoning and inference and intelligence, and then you've got people talking about cognitive control, and they're all talking about the same region, right? Maybe, but it's
not entirely.
It's basically, John Duncan, it's parietal frontal. For Richard Heyer, it's parietal frontal.
Yes, but it's important to note that John Duncan is a little different from, I guess, and David could speak to it a little bit more, but I would categorize John and David differently. Because but wait, why? Because John Duncan had this idea that he revised multiple times, and sometimes he goes back and forth on them, that the entire prefrontal cortex does the same thing, basically. And at some point that the entire frontal cortex does the same thing. But sometimes in some papers, he says, oh no, but Brahman area 10 does something else. Oh no, but the anterior and medial, maybe something, maybe lateral, but he's not consistent about it. But there's a lot of people in the field that are like, I'm not just interested in generally what it can do, that generally it might be able to, if generally it's impaired, what gets impaired, but specifically which regions, what kind of architecture, what kind of gradients. For instance, the paper from 2009 of David that I put here that I've cited a lot is the wonderful Nature Reviews Neuroscience with Desposito on the rostrocaudal axis of the frontal lobes and how it potentially supports hierarchical processing. That back then it was just lateral. Now we have some evidence that medial might have similar things too. So I would say there is differences in the focus. I would say that there is a tradition in prefrontal cortex and executive function that focuses on components, tasks, and doesn't particularly concern itself with the symbolism, with the symbolist kind of ideas of intelligence that has to do with language and logic. Instead of that, the focus is on particular tasks and particular cognitive components. And I mean, David can say a lot.
But that's the point I'm making. That's the point I'm making. I mean, you're precise. Exactly what I mean, you can just be just as granular, decompositional from the cognitive control side as you can from the intelligence, the abstraction. But all I'm saying is when you mention knowledge to the left, let me ask you and you mentioned all those things in that thing, abstraction. Where are they?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack here. So I'll jump in. So these are great questions. So first off, I don't want to throw my indexer under the bus, but I guarantee you that I discuss things like representation and thinking and inference in the book. I just may not have shown up in the index.
But not a lot, actually. Not a lot.
They're not focused. They're not a focus, right? I'm not talking that much about thought as a cognitive problem, right? I'm assuming that thought happens. Where I get at most I get into that is I talk about episodic future thought, because I'm interested in how people generate goals and generate predictions about the future and so forth. So that is the case. I'm setting that aside. So that is a distinction, I think, right? So where is knowledge? I do think the prefrontal cortex is involved in knowledge. So one place I think knowledge exists is in these systems that incorporate the medial temporal lobe and the hippocampus and have a map-like representation that's very suitable for doing things like planning. Why? Because map-like representations allow you to decide things about where I can go in the forward and backward in different directions, right? If I'm mapping that to a task space, I can do all kinds of interesting inference and prediction on that space. Right, but I actually think of and we have a paper, a postdoc in my lab, Avi Vaidya, and I wrote a paper in Trends in Cognitive Science talking about this almost exact problem. Where we started, so I feel like I'm digressing on my digression, but we started with kind of your question, John, in the sense that we were studying, we had published a paper last year on abstract task representations, and we highlighted these frontoparietal networks, while people were basically doing tasks where they had to generalize based on an abstract task representation. But we realized, and we're very aware of, in fact, we had pre-registered our hypotheses, and we were expecting to find like medial frontal and hippocampal systems that have been associated with these kinds of sort of task states and and abstract task representations, and we didn't really see that, and we were confused about that because there's a whole literature out there that highlights those networks. And so what the problem then we were interested in this review is, why would you have kind of representations in both of these networks, right? What does it mean? Is there a difference between them? And kind of our speculative answer is it has to do with the format of the representation, not the content, sort of an old distinction in cognitive science, right? So the idea being that you need something like a map like representation is very useful for knowledge, right? But something like a production, for example, right, which sets up conditions under which you do next conditions, might be more useful for a control kind of representation. And that things like the corticosteroidal loops that I was mentioning in my talk, right, are well suited to those kinds of production-based representations. And so the problem then becomes, how do you translate from a very, large numbers of degrees of freedom kind of map-like knowledge representation and prediction to a set of productions that allow you to carry something out. And so I do think there's a distinction then between the knowledge side and the control side. But of course, the tricky bit is that thinking itself can be controlled, right? So you can engage in sequential reasoning, right? And in fact, I give examples of this in the book also in the memory chapter, of patients that their memory problem is one of not organizing their thought in such a way that they can draw inferences, like, for instance, like what's the length of an average human spine or something like that, right? That they don't know. They have to go through a process.
Right. I mean, that was a beautiful example. And all I'm saying is that, you actually outlined how you estimated what the length of a spinal cord would be. You go through a thought process, right?
Right.
But all I'm saying is, and I'm not criticizing, I mean, you make it very clear throughout the book. You actually have a sentence at the end of the book where you consider sort of thinking and control different. All I'm saying is that one could write a book on thinking and talk about very similar structures. And right. so there's just a slight, two ships passing in the night feel, like people who are interested in, well, where are the abstract thoughts? Where's the idea of justice living? Where's the idea of being a science? In other words, but that's fine.
The EDR can talk about abstract concepts.
Yeah, right? So right, but all that. So where are they? That's what I've been asking. Given all that surgery on EDR that you showed, I was just asking. So where are they in your view?
I don't think they're in the frontal lobe. Yeah, I think that I think one guess is it's in these systems that it's not just in MTL. It's an associated. It could be, in other areas, right, in neocortical areas, but in those kinds of systems, it actually
but that's fine. I mean, just because and then of course, as I said, people like Richard Heine, there'll be people doing work on IQ and G and all that. So that's fine. The other thing I found found about the book is it felt very.
John, can I maybe open something that might be helpful here? Because you're asking something very profound, John, and I haven't seen that being asked like that. So let me try to say something about the term, for instance, inference, and why it doesn't necessarily need the prefrontal cortex. Bye. Okay.
I'm right here. I'm getting my water. I have earphones on.
I know. I'm joking. So it's to wake everybody up if they're not awake. Okay, so inference in itself doesn't need the kind of production that David is talking about. Why am I saying that? There's a lot of work on inference happening in the hippocampus. And how does it happen? Very simply, if I have a slow learning rate, I learn the first representation, and then I learn the second one and the third one multiple times in a temporal sequence, I make the A to C inference just because of the, in the regions of the brain that have a longer temporal horizon. So they still have lingering representation of A when I see B and C. And so they do already have a combined representation of A and C. So the inference of A, then B, B, then C, therefore inference A, then C, that can happen with a very simple associative learning. It doesn't need the kind of generative thought or generative processes or mechanisms that that David is talking about. So let's look at what are the examples of those that don't exist, for instance, in the hippocampus, right? So let's say I have a template of the kind of hidden latent states of an airport. I know generally what to do in an airport. And now there is a new airport that I need to go in Tokyo. I have never been to Japan. I don't speak the language. I don't know what the environment is organized. The architect was extremely creative. Things are very strange. Things are written vertically, etc. I still will know what the latent states are. And then I will look in the environment for cues that are going to tell me when the conditions of doing the tasks that I need to do are met, and when those in very strange and novel things in the environment may correspond to a latent state, things I've never seen before. That it's not enough to have a hippocampus. For that, associative learning, if you want to do it zero shot, is not enough. You need to have stored some kind of a latent idea, latent structure of airports and the task sets that I need to do in the specific order, and they're hierarchical, otherwise I will be basically escorted out or worse. So those things I am able to apply to infinite number of new airports, at least on Earth. I don't know what happens in airport on Mars, but like on Earth, I can apply to infinite number of airports, or countable infinite, not because there's going to be finite number. Does that make sense? The difference between...
but where are your abstract representations of airports?
Okay, so here's the thing that I want to tell you. There is the notion of schema that is the closest to the notion that I used. The idea of schema, very few people who have done experiments on that, and latent representations, includes Yael Niv, includes Bob Wilson, who worked with Yael Niv. This includes, for instance, Chris Baldessano, who's currently at Columbia. This includes Ken Norman, and a bunch of others who have recently done work on this idea of latent states, or this idea of schema. It's always been anterior medial prefrontal cortex that somehow shows up. And you know what? 15 years ago or such, people like David, based on the architecture of the prefrontal cortex that they were suggesting, they would have projected that the anterior prefrontal cortex would have been the region for these things. Why? Because they were talking about a kind of abstraction hierarchy along the long axis being the rostral to caudal, so like this. And then in addition to that, there was this idea that lateral prefrontal cortex is a little bit more action oriented, whereas the medial gradients of the prefrontal cortex, because it's closer to basal ganglia and it's closer to hippocampus, are more concerned with value and memories, depending on which parts of it you're looking at. So medial anterior prefrontal cortex, a priori, we would have hypothesized this would be the region where you would see unfolding of certain schemas. Now, do schemas always live there? We don't know if they always live there, if they are stored maybe in the lateral temporal cortices when they get consolidated and called back to unfold in the prefrontal cortex. It's almost like unloading a new algorithm when it's needed and then storing it on the shelf. And then when you bring it back, you're not just playing a record, You are unfolding a new program that runs a new algorithm in the prefrontal cortex, right? That is a little different from how regular inference happens, from how things that we have rehearsed a lot happens. So do you see the difference?
Well, I definitely agree with, I think you're making my point. We're in the prefrontal cortex for abstract notions like airports. And, so all I'm saying is that
I'm saying inference doesn't necessarily need that kind of production.
Yeah, so but I'm saying that some forms of inference do, right? If you walk out in the middle of the summer of your house and the ground is wet and it's only in front of your house, you're going to go, well, it probably didn't rain. What happened? Somebody spilled a bucket or a pipe burst. So you go through a series of inferences about why is the ground in front of my house wet? Now, I would bet $1 million that that's a prefrontal cortical thought process.
But now, you can also do a lot of those inferences based on your statistical knowledge of the world.
Sure.
That's consolidated, right? So if you were a patient, you might still not think that it was raining in front of your, if you were a prefrontal patient, you might still not think it was raining just in front of your apartment. That's what I'm trying to say. At least you were saying that the terms like inference, thought, meaning or semantics weren't happening. What I'm trying to say is not all of them need the PFC. And there are versions of them that actually don't need the PFC. And the parts of them that might, they actually need the kinds of operations that David and others are specifying. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry, it was a long diversion. Sorry, David.
It's a really important one because it gets at this fundamental idea. First off, that itself is not. I think is contentious in some sectors, right? That there is this knowledge. And I'm calling knowledge action dissociation, but it's putting on the action in things like processes and transformations and orderings of thoughts that lead to inferences. And I think it's reasonable to draw this distinction between the kinds of generalizations out of abstraction that require productions and those that don't, right? Or require some sort of an ordered thought process and those that don't. And for example, I could imagine that learning would be different across those two cases, right? So you can see the kinds of practice-based learning, right, that the power law of practice occur for things like geometry proofs and things like that, right, that are you would think of as being very mental based processes, but a lot of that is because doing geometry proofs requires a whole bunch of organization of thought, right, retrieval of axioms, ordering of them, prioritizing them, deciding, and so that you can engage. So then to allow whatever if you're thinking about generalization in terms of a associative learning mechanism or statistical learning, allowing that to basically do its work requires making available those kinds of representations. So I think that distinction, that's the distinction that I'm trying to get to, is I think that I'm not sure that our abstract notion of airports is stored in the prefrontal cortex. I mean, if it is, I agree with you, it would be like a medial frontal part of that would be in that network, and it wouldn't be lateral frontal. But I'm not sure that that's the case. Whereas I think that a task that requires you to go through a set of operations in order to generate an inference about airports would depend on prefrontal cortex.
So just to push you on that. So what about the idea of cognitive control? Where's that?
So that's required for that process of serial reasoning.
No, this is the idea of cognitive control, just the idea of it.
Unpacking of the schema into a set of hierarchical actions that you can actually do. Right. Unpacking your knowledge that you don't need the PFC necessarily for into something that's actionable. That's why what David was saying, that the PFC patient, could do inferences on paper, could ace the tests on paper, but it's actual actions, transferring knowledge to action was important. Does that make sense?
There's still a paradox here, because frontotemporal dementia, for example, they become demented. They're not just like a frontal patient, right?
Well, the frontal going ones become very much like frontal patients, right?
They become frontal as well. But okay, I guess what I'm saying is that your book seems to be, in the best sense of the word, quite hydraulic. It's about, you call it flow control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's all about switching and gates and loops. It's very process oriented, right? And you even go from selection and I don't believe in the basal ganglia selection theory. I mean, we don't have time to talk about that, but nevertheless, you go from sort of motor action selection to a working memory analog of that, which you and Michael did. But it's very much saying, look, we've got this general architecture of striatum and loops. We've got this general switching ability. and you take a fairly simple set of hydraulic primitives, and then you use them in a sort of stacking way for any level, all the way from motor to intermediate to abstract. And again, but the abstraction hierarchy never really gets addressed. It's just taken for granted that the contents can change, and then you can turn this hydraulic crank with similar architecture and do it for working memory, do it for thought. So I don't mind the hydraulic nature of the book and the sort of, but it seems to me, and it's very interesting, just to finish, you reviewed Richard Passingham's book, and I think, this is Richard Passingham's book, by the way, right? Now, what's really interesting about this book is it's almost entirely on the macaque. Right? And then towards the end of the book, and you can imagine poor Dick beginning to get kind of tired, right? It's a very long book. And you read the last parts of the book, right? And basically, he wants to try and get to the expansion of the human prefrontal cortex to explain, lo and behold, all the things that humans can do. Abstraction, planning way into the future, language, semantics, all these things, right?
Right.
And all we get over and over again, and he says it, expansion of this area, expansion of that area.
More of it.
No, more of it, right? In other words, it's not exactly hydraulic, but it's sort of going, I don't know where all this extra stuff that leads to learning salon debates like this comes from. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to take it for granted in a hydraulic view, like you do, or I'm going to just say, it expands, and somehow the algorithms don't change, the loops don't change, the content does somehow, and voila, we've got the distance between the macaque and the... So it all seems to me, whether it's your version of the book or Richard Passingham's, that the extra stuff, the weird content that gets operated on is not really talked about, right? Mm-hmm. It's just accept that it gets churned into the hydraulics. Right.
I see. So you mean in terms of the content of what goes into that?
Yes. It just barely gets mentioned.
I agree with you. I like your term, sort of the hydraulics, because I think it does emphasize, and maybe it's worth the cartoon of this initially to test these ideas, right? To say that that's what makes it hard, right? To act on knowledge, right? Is you're going from a fundamentally not hydraulic, not hierarchical knowledge system, right? I mean, we abandoned that as cognitive scientists long ago after Collins and Quillian, right? It's not ordered and it's not hierarchical in kinds of the way we represent things semantically in our knowledge, but we have to somehow move that into a system that is physically constrained, is relatively hierarchical in terms of at the lowest level, right? The motor system and so forth. And we have to get from one to the other in a dynamic world, right? Where you have to be able to move efficiently under certain types of condition setting states. And so really it becomes a problem if you want to have an acting person to engage in a task, if translating this non-hierarchical kinds of knowledge into a system that is a production-based system, right? That where you can basically say, I need states that set other kinds of outcomes. And if you can get that effectively, you'll behave efficiently. And one interesting thing is that we have, again, in the simple task domain, because it's hard to do in the complex one, but there, you can show that people will transfer things like these gating policies, right, to behave efficiently in a new task, right? Given that you can reduce the time it takes them to acquire a new task by giving them those states ahead of time, right? And so that can be it's a part of their task knowledge that's not the rule. There's nothing to do with like the relationship between the stimulus,
right.
With how you sort of order the information and set it as a condition for how you behave, and you can build that into your task set. You can transfer it like it's a form of task knowledge, and in fact, that's what's determining the early part of the learning curve when people acquire the new task. Right.
Just my last question, just about the Stroop, the famous Cohen-Botvinnik neural network model of the Stroop task. Again, extremely hydraulic-y to me, but I do have a question about, you say, I think at least twice in the book, and it very much comes to my debates, which I'd love to have with you, about the striatum deciding between movements. No, it doesn't, right? But nevertheless, you say at some point in your, which I loved, you say, but somebody might ask, well, how does the striatum know? Something like that. You have and you go, well, it doesn't. There's no homunculus.
Right.
Because you trained the network to strengthen those connections down. Okay, but no, you can introduce somebody like me to the Stroop task for the first time ever. I've never trained on it. And I can suppress the desire to read out the word and name the color in one trial. I use knowledge to not do it. So I wasn't trained on the Stroop task once. It's the first time I've ever seen it. So how do I tell myself to take a contextual signal, increase my reaction time, suppress the desire to read the word color, and get the task done? That is knowledge at that moment doing it. Nothing was trained, right? So how do you do the Stroop test for the first time in your life, the first time?
Well, I mean, you're probably familiar with the response to this, right? But it's that you have been trained to do in the kinds of abstract policies you need to the Stroop task. It just was over the course of your development, right? That you did.
Yeah, but that's a total cop out, right?
Well, okay, but I agree with you. But that is the response.
Yeah, but it's right. But is that your response?
The claim is, right, and there's some reasonable modeling behind this, right? So there was this work by Rougier years ago showing that, with across multiple tasks, right, that rely on, say, color. You may be familiar with this, right? The network would start to extract something like color as its own context, and that made it easier for it to use color or use color in an abstract way, right? And so it was some evidence that you could abstract across or build that kind of component across multiple tasks. And so I think the claim would be that's what you do over the course of your life. You're building these control policies and learning how to link them to knowledge, so that when you're given a new task, like a Stroop task, you can rapidly find the right.
But you still have to understand the instruction and know how to apply it.
I agree with you, and that's the thing that makes it control. The understanding the knowledge part, this comes back to your original question, is not in my book. Right? I don't know how you understand when someone says to you, here's the rule for a Stroop test. What I'm interested in is how do you, let's say you understand what you're supposed to do, in the sense that you know what should happen, right? I understand I should say what the ink color is, and I shouldn't say the word, right? And I should expect, I can even imagine myself doing that, right? Saying the thing, whatever, all of that I can do. I can understand the task very well. I've got to map that into actually doing it. So I get now the word and I have to do those things. That requires that, you have policies in place that you can rely on for you to do it quickly. Otherwise, it would take lots and lots of training. But because you've done lots of things like that involve color, and you can, and it's compositional, right? You've represented these tasks in such a way that you can take pieces of those prior tasks and reuse them. Then that's how you're able to do it for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I just feel like, in finishing about this, that, as you say, that was not the purpose of the book. This was about the hydraulics post knowledge. I do feel, in a way, that for people who aren't aware, that, as you just said, I have no idea how you understand what the Stroop test is before you get going. You start doing the pumping and the looping and the controlling. I do think that it's a huge part of the puzzle that we still have to link up with this hydraulics to understand. And in a way, I thought that your training escape in the Cohen-Botvinnik Stroop network was to sort of not mention, well, that isn't obviating the mystery. It's not like we've gotten rid of it.
How do we do the link? I agree, should be part of the book. So what I meant was not part of the book, because I don't know how we understand language. But what I'm curious about is, how do we link that explicit knowledge? I think that is control. How do we link that explicit knowledge to the right control policies? That very much is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you.
And in fact, I mean, just to come back one more time to this negative transfer effect, I think I think gets to your point, right? Is that, and this is why I think it's an interesting. So this is a paper that a postdoc, Apurva Bhandari, in my lab, and I published in Cognition, like 2018. Right. So that was a very simple demonstration. It was just to show that if we gave people a task that involved input gating and working memory, so you had to take a context and decide which upcoming item you put in working memory for a response. Okay, but your only experience with the task was one in which, for instance, you had you did the sort of context let's see how we did it exactly. So if we gave you the whole time, we only gave you the context first, and then we switched to being context last. You would sort of have to do it. You have to put everything in working memory because you don't know what thing to control. Or if you aren't given the context, it tells you what item to make your response on. Then there's the environment constrains what you're doing. But if we do it the other way around, right, so that we give you the context last repeatedly, you've never had experience with a context that appears first. You're always just putting everything in the task into working memory and then making your response. And now we give you a case where we give you the context first. So you have the opportunity to select the thing from working memory, right? But you don't have to. You can still wait till the end and make your choice. Is that people initially, right, do it the inefficient way. If they've already been doing we kind of predispose them to do it one way, right? And then they have to kind of figure out through experience in that case, there's a more efficient way to do it. Eventually they do. And in fact, once they figure that out, they never do it again. It's not like that's a switching effect, right? So it's clear that there's adjustment that's experience-based, even within the performance.
Right, there's an aha moment. There's an aha moment.
Right set of those control processes that you need to be able to put that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that experiment was lovely, that there's some kind of aha moment where you go, wait a minute, I don't have to use the context last. I don't have to do the output version of control. I can do the input gating version of control. It's a kind of moment of insight, basically.
Right. So it depends on the library being there, right, that you have those control policies. But that linking requires a combination of a prediction of what you think the best policy would be, but then experience where you make adjustments and you find the right one. And then there's got to be a process by which we automate, which eventually we start consolidating and change, and these things change to become even more efficient over time, which is its own conversation.
Thank you. Awesome.
Thank you so much, John. Before I go into my own questions and read the questions from the audience, and please remember to add your questions. There is no kind of barriers to any question that you might want to ask. I just wanted to say I appreciate what John was doing, which was identifying, I guess, the history and philosophy of science trends, or the kind of trends that history and philosophy of science could identify in sort of a particular domain in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience and psychology around tasks, control, that is very much closer, interestingly, when I'm thinking about it, the figures that I know of are closer aligned with connectionism as opposed to symbolic AI, for instance, because my brain has to translate everything to computational models. And John is definitely right in that there is a lot of inspirations from, I guess, hydraulics, but I would just say it's more as dynamical systems. And because this is the, I'm thinking of the 1990 paper that I pasted in the chat by John Cohen and others on the neural network model of Stroop task, which is called On the Control of Automatic Processes, about parallel distributed processing account of the Stroop effect. Something, John, that I'm thinking about that paper and those approaches that I was trained in, actually, is that there is this idea of these sort of the nodes of the neural network and what the different computations are that happens. And we, before the boom of deep learning and it being available with just one button, we used to write the nodes and the equations for what would happen in a neural network ourselves. And sometimes you would analyze a neural network just to see what kind of equations, what kind of dynamical systems it's allowing to happen. So when we looked at the neural network architecture, we saw in our heads or on the slides of somebody, or wrote down on the whiteboard the equation that was allowed by this to happen to an input that was coming or to a set of inputs and what kind of output would go. We had an idea of a mathematical equation. Still right now, a lot of theoretical computer science folks at MSR and at other places, and people who are in other sciences still at Princeton, John Cohen and others, they do this analysis still of what's the dynamical systems equation. A lot of metaphors for dynamical systems equations, as you correctly noted, came from the science of physics. That's why we have so many famous physicists who very easily entered into this field and advanced these ideas of neural networks in various ways. As we know, a lot of them are still at Princeton, and they were founders of the field. And many of them still do great work because there is this possibility of translating some of these neural networks into equations. And some of these equations are extremely familiar to control engineers, to physicists, because they have seen this before. They've seen this movie before. It's just that there's a different, they've seen this genre of movie before. It's like, maybe it's a noir, and like now it's happening in Morocco, and in the other one it was happening in, like, that's how they see it, right? So I understand the concern that you have, that we might be turning, that if we're not careful, this particular way of thinking about the functions of the prefrontal cortex and cognition might turn us into a subcategory of physics or control engineering. So I understand the bigger picture philosophy of science point that you're making. But at the same time, I would add to that, not but and, I would say you're totally right. And there is, of course, the more representational hierarchy of representations, specific notions of abstraction and everything, that actually, when I talk to those physicists, they're like, okay, I don't get this part anymore. They stop there, because those parts, then all of a sudden for them, it's this kind of, it used to be a magical land, but as we see people like Bengio and a lot of other folks in the kind of AI community are trying to approach that field, albeit somewhat like, timidly, still thinking about the kind of the fast and slow systems, which is not exactly, it's not a dichotomy. So like the thinking fast and slow, a lot of the experiments in that are also, later on didn't replicate. So there's just ways in which we think about it a little more in a more complex way, rather than just that. So the whole thinking fast and slow, in some ways, it's just a very much simplified version of what David is talking about, in a manner of speaking. There is some automatic processes, there is some control processes. Now, instead of David just saying there is system 1 and system 2, he's saying, let us understand, and not just David, everybody in this field, let us understand very much more clearly what are the different ways in which this cognitive control system works at all. And that is not something that I think, in my opinion, a lot of people who talk about system 1 and system 2, they just abstract away all of it together as system 2. They throw away together language, reasoning, everything that they haven't been able to explain with their physicist models. They just throw it there and they're like, this is system 2. So I'm very glad that you mentioned that, and I totally agree with the concern. But I also can see the benefits of borrowing from whatever field or discipline that gives a mathematical tool to understand the many different facets of this cognitive control, instead of just dumping all of them into the bucket of system 2. I talked a lot, but I wanted to both appreciate what you're saying, but also highlight that in spite of the merits of your very astute analysis of this idea of the hydraulic metaphor and the ways in which it's flow dynamics and control engineering applied to brains, and I'm very with you. Many talks actually frustrate me at the simplification. I think there is a range of richness in this area that can benefit from these metaphors and tools without losing substance. And David, I'm going to ask you to talk for 5 minutes just to cover for the fact that I heard my voice too long. What do you think of all this?
I think you're making a number of great points. I'll just add to them on this. I mean, one thing to bear in mind, right, when we're talking about cognitive control. So control is, I think the field has benefited tremendously from ideas from control theory, right, and including dynamical systems ideas and ideas from control. But I think that, of course, there's so control that obeys those principles exists at multiple levels, right, in the mind and brain, right? I mean, neurons have control systems that will obey those kinds of dynamical systems, equations. You'll have networks that will, and those aren't necessarily, we want to call every case of a system that is control, that can be analyzed in a control system way, as being cognitive control. I think what makes it cognitive control, and this is getting to John's point, right, is that's specifically the case of control based on this kind of functional level definition, right? That we have knowledge about a task and we're monitoring and we're using that in order to guide, achieve certain types of goals. And this is, by the way, just to come back to a point that John raised earlier about intelligence, right? This is, and John Duncan's definition, I think he's talking about the same thing I am. He's calling your ability to do lots of tasks really quickly and so forth, intelligence. And that's, I think that's not everybody's definition of it. That's fluid intelligence typically, right? And to some degree, but it's that level of control that is interesting in terms of cognitive control, and that's the kind of thing that that would be lost potentially in patients that have problems in cognitive control. And so, I guess that's the only thing I would add to what you were saying. Otherwise, I fully agree with your analysis.
John, did you want to add something?
No, I think I mean, by the way, I mean, just to say, David, I think that the experiments, I mean, and, as I said, before we all came online, we're doing a lot of cognitive control experiments as well. In fact, Adrian, who was a postdoc and now runs a lab essentially, is doing lots of really lovely cognitive control work. I think it's extremely insightful to see what's going on. I mean, we need to know about selection and switching and multitasking and dual tasking and stopping and inhibiting and automaticity versus all these things are just rich experimental material. It's just, as you said, I feel like you can slot different degrees of abstract content into those processes, like a cassette. Let's make it a thought, let's make a movement. And I've always been very interested, as everyone knows, probably deeply bored by me at this point, that I also think that I'm interested in what's in the cassette that gets slotted into these loops.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'll give you an example of that, of a good question that I don't have a good answer to, right? But it's maybe related to what you're saying, right? So in the way that I conceptualize control in the book and the way we talk about it a lot in the field, it's arbitrary, you're right? It's a pure, the symbol doesn't matter, right? So if I give you a rule that's says it can be arbitrary, and in fact, that's why we design our experiments. Color red, and you hear this kind of tone recently, then you make this key response. If you saw that other tone, you get red, you make this other key response. And these are arbitrary rules. And we do that as a way of control. But a lot of rules in our world are causal, for example. They have structure to them that makes them feel that they're not arbitrary in that way, right? And so, when I turn on a light, yes, I know that that action will turn on a light, but I think it has a causal relationship, and that actually lends itself in the knowledge domain to certain advantages, right? If I know there's a causal relationship, I can draw inferences that are counterfactual, right? Like if the light's not on, I can say things about the switch, things like that. But we don't really know a lot about the benefits it would have for control, right? Is it the case that doesn't matter if I have that prediction based on a causal structure, or it's fully arbitrary? I sort of agree, right? In the way, the kinds of tools we've applied to it, we wouldn't say that the brain would treat that any differently in terms of how it would set up the policy. But it might be that interacts with the way that it implements it, and in fact, we'll maybe better at it, more efficient. There could be all kinds of ways that's interesting. That hasn't been explored, and that's one example, I think, of what you're.
And you have a point in your book. Forgive me if I'm misremembering, where you and Michael, I think, did an experiment where people couldn't resist inferring structure, as you're saying, when there wasn't any.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
In other words, right? And so this desire to explain things, to understand them, to infer structure when it's there, that like Maxwell said, ostensibly as a child, what's the go of that?
Right.
That kind of thing, which you even talk about in the book, it's presupposed by the control structure. It's not explained by the control structure.
Yeah. But I think it's important. I mean, the case of structure, I think, is important, because I think it's that tendency of thought that allows us to be compositional in the way we don't learn. We like to learn and represent tasks in this compositional way, not because it's the most efficient thing to do that task, but because it allows us to build every task we learn becomes part of that library. What we don't know is, right, how other kinds of structure beyond the kind of hierarchical structures which again can be arbitrary apart from the way that they conditionalize each other, right? How that aspect of the meaning of those units impacts the structures, I don't know.
So I'm very glad that we discussed this part a little bit more in detail, because although it seems like a philosophy of science type of discussion, I think it's very important for, it made me realize what is the part where maybe might help in future discussions with John. We've had like 2 years of discussions about this, and I hope we're going to have 200 more, excuse me, because John is eternal. And so one of the things that I noticed, John, is the distinction between knowledge or a representation that is static versus a task. Task or task hierarchy. David, okay, we keep losing your camera somehow.
I'm back now, sorry.
Okay, awesome. So, and then unfolding of the knowledge into a sequence of actions that you course correct whenever needed. That second part is the part that we are particularly into. And just having stored some abstract knowledge somewhere is not enough. Just having some map of the world, no matter how fancy and how multi-scale, is not enough. What is important and necessary here, and that is when the prefrontal cortex has been compared to, by various people, to the conductor of the brain. Like there is a lot of different parts that need to play together in order for the symphony to happen. And the prefrontal cortex is doing the kind of conductor thing so that they happen in the right order and with the right synchronization so that things actually work out. Because like if my left foot and right foot try to go forward together, I'm just going to fall. And so there are certain things that need a particular sequence. Now, there are parts of the brain before prefrontal that can handle things like me walking and not falling. So not all kinds of motor control would require the same kind of cognitive control David is talking about. There are things that obviously would require some cognitive control, but the motor aspect of them is contingent on the particular experiment. It could be that the output was verbal or eye movement, and that's what we mean by motor. So I think we might want to separate, and I like that David separated control, various kinds of control in different circuits in the brain versus cognitive control. And I think that those two distinctions are helpful that came out of our conversations, like more lucidly than before. Like a static representation, or even not static, but like gradually accumulating representations of knowledge. But turning that knowledge into a sequence of action is its own whole beast. That beast, especially when it comes to multitasking, needs more and more of the anterior PFC. I'll give another patient example. Patients with damage to the anterior prefrontal cortex, Brabant area 10, which is my downtown area. It's like my favorite region of the brain. When they had that damage, this was a 1990 study that they did at UCL. One thing that they showed was that they were very good on paper on everything. You would give them a piece of paper and you would tell them to go and buy a piece of paper from that shop, buy a pen from that other shop, and then go to the post office and post something. They would just zigzag all over the street and not be able to accomplish it in the way that non-damaged adults would be able to do. Why? It's not because they forgot the rules. It's just their ability to apply these the instructions into a hierarchical set of actions was completely impaired. And so I really appreciate this distinction between knowledge, turning knowledge into a sequence of action, and how prefrontal patients, that's the part where they get damaged. And the more abstract the task is, or the more multitasking or hierarchical it is, the more anterior PFC damage actually matters, not just any part of PFC. And then secondly, this distinction between different kinds of control that David was mentioning, which is there are many types of control. Similar equations could apply to different parts of the brain, but cognitive control is particularly different because it's in this particular domain. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think the only thing I add is that, you know, with kind of sequential tasks, you're adding in this element of temporal abstraction, which I talk about in the book too, the fact that you're having to abstract a task over time, right? You're doing the same task, even though you've got, and there's multiple other things you're doing, and you're projecting, and you're doing that over some range towards some point in the future, right? And that brings up its own kind of problems for the control system, right? And you know, so one issue is within like things like monitoring is that when does the system actually engage in control in the sense of making sure that you're staying on your set point, which is your task in this example, right? This thing you want to do, right? There's also the, you know, how have you organized that behavior, right, to yield that predicted response in the future, and are you kind of selecting appropriately as you go? And you know, those are some of those problems have been, you know, recognized for years. You know, class Ashley talk about the kinds of, you know, errors and sequences that people make, right, that show how we're vulnerable to making errors, but that our system yet seems to continue with the tasks even after we've made them, which suggests we don't monitor continuously.
Yeah, there was a Carl Pribram paper. Remember, there's a paper with three famous authors. Pribram is one of them. Not paper, book. Was from the 60s.
The Miller book. Is that what?
Yes.
Miller, Gallanter, and Pribram. Yeah.
Yes, Miller, Gallanter, and Pribram. I forget the name.
Structure of behavior or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
I talk about it in the book, actually.
That's I'm going to find it and put it in the chat, because I feel like it's very much related to the point you were making about structure, to the idea of organizing behavior, and a lot of these, and obviously a lot of us are descendants of that intellectual tradition.
Well, I mean, Miller, pointed in that book. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. But it really at this, knowledge action dissociation. Remember, he was kind of arguing with behaviorists who had decidedly said there was no such thing, right? You have this sort of direct route from stimulus to response, and you can describe all of psychology if you get the right list of these things. And the idea that you'd have, that there's an important process sitting there in the middle, I think was something that he highlights in that book. And for him, it's like in terms of a plan, which he structures as, his tote architecture.
I mean, I can, listening to this, I was just thinking of an example for everyone, for these three things, if you're playing a game of tennis, right, and you go, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a drop shot, bring the player up to the front, and then when they're right up at the net, I'm going to lob the ball over them, and they're not going to be able to get to it. So you really think about it. You go drop shot, then lob, okay? Now, one possibility, of course, is, as you said, is you're just so bad at tennis that you can't drop shot or lob and you miss horrendously, right? That's the motor control side, right? Great idea, shame about the execution. But then you can have the intermediate control version that you and I are talking about, which is drop shot, you do it, the player runs up to the net just like you said, and then you do a drop shot again, right? And they're already there at the net. You know that you should have lobbed over them, but for some reason you couldn't get the actions into the sequence, and you drop shot them again, and of course you lose because they're right there at the net after the first one, and you lose. So those are three examples of great idea, drop shot, lob, you thought about it. You can fail on execution in two ways. You can fail motorically, which, as I just said, that's not a prefrontal thing, or you just perseverate on the first drop shot and do it again, even though it was rightly executed, a control problem. So those are three things, but dreaming up the idea that I'm going to drop shot them and then lob them is before you mess it up in terms of flow.
That's right. And I think what's interesting in that too, I mean, just to add to that, I think is that if that was something you did, a strategy you came up with then you've never had before, that obviously is requiring a lot of control. But what's interesting about, I mean, sports are a great example of this because there's control. It's just not cognitive control, right? A lot of it is external control because these players have to move so fast, right? Their whole training is to learn all the conditions, right? That can control what they need to do, basically through external inputs, right? It's controlled behavior, just very automated, and so if they do that sequence enough, right, that's their thing. I mean, I don't know enough
right.
Mm-hmm. They have that strategy a lot. They become extremely efficient at it, including even basic contingencies, whether the player moves toward the net or away from the net. All that gets executed very quickly without the need for control.
Without the thought bit. Yeah.
In fact, what's interesting is those are the cases where if you try to control it, you actually mess it up. Right, it's like when you really learn the skill well and you start paying attention to what you're doing. That's
it's like when you're playing the piano. If you try to think what you're doing, you're not gonna play as efficiently. Especially if you're playing. Sometimes I'm playing something, I'm like, oh, I'm doing so well. How am I doing this? And then I can't. Like I mess it up. I make an error. Yeah. Another thing I want to say, John, like there are two failures of perspective memory, which is the ability to do a task set right now, but in my mind, I keep in mind that after this, I need to do something when some conditions are met. For instance, I'm saying, at the end, remind John, after the session, remind John of such and such, right? There is an event that marks when I can actually activate that task set and execute it, which is when this event ends. And right now I'm doing something else. If I think I have to tell John something, I have to the whole time, I'm not going to be able to engage in this conversation. And this is, something that I have studied. This was my PhD thesis. This is perspective memory. You can decode it from anterior prefrontal cortex when you're doing other things. Now, there are two failures of this, which are very similar to your example. One failure is I could just forget to tell you. Another failure is I could tell you, but forget that I told you and tell you again. And that's when, old adults take the same pill twice sometimes. So there are two different types of failures of perspective memory, at least, that are very different from each other. And these are failures of cognitive control in some ways. Right. Mm-hmm. They're not just motor anymore. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a little It's very similar in that it's a parallel to the examples you are providing in some ways, but it's entirely cognitive. And that's why, for instance, there are so many different ways of environmentally assisting these older adults. By like having an app where you click it, or having like a thing that you have to take the pill from that for your day from that, so that if the pill is there, it means you haven't taken it. If you have taken it, then it's done. Right. And so, so there are many things that, and there are a large number of studies on older adults and prospective memory. NASA was working on the deficiencies of prospective memory in pilots because it's extremely important in moments where if you forget to do a particular task, you could completely fall, basically. It could be deadly especially for aviators. Mm-hmm. So there are many, and then especially these things get very taxed and more difficult to handle under stress, when you're sleep deprived, when the situation is super highly stressful, when basically your working memory has noise in it. And so some of the work, for instance, that I had done was to extend the stroke model to make a prospective memory model that's similar to that. And by adding noise to different parts of it, simulate these kinds of deficits of prospective memory. Yeah. So it was possible to not only understand certain cognitive, different mechanisms for a cognitive capacity that requires cognitive control and task sets and memory and everything using a neural network, but it's also possible by injecting noise in different parts to test hypotheses about whether this neural network will behave like the patient's when I ablate this area of it, or when I actually inject noise into this other area, and which one of them is going to mimic the elderly, which one of them is going to mimic people with working memory capacities that are lower or higher, which one of them is going to mimic children, etc.
Yeah, and I think these capacity limits also run up against, again, this sort of, coming back to the point we made earlier, these knowledge action kind of distinctions, right? There's probably a limit to the degree you can implement a plan, right? So if I have, which is going to depend on those capacities. So if I could come up with a 6-move plan in tennis or in chess or something, right? But if I don't, but I have to sequence that out, right? If I don't, I'm going to lose set, and then I have to replan again. So you experience a replanning cost at that point, or you've lost set entirely. And so you could make predictions along those lines too about complex sequences and how deep you could go. And I don't know of good work like that, but it'd be really interesting to do.
Do we have people, Ida, in the question boxes?
We do. We have 4 questions, and then I'll ask 2 questions that I have left. So the first question is by Olga. Olga, are you here, and would you be able to come on screen to ask your question? Let me see. Olga seems to be here. I'm going to invite her to screen and see if we can have Olga. I'm going to invite the other person who didn't say to ask their questions offline, whose name is Pankaj. And let's see if they're both here and they can join us to ask their questions themselves. Olga is accepted and she's connecting. Hi, Olga.
Hi.
Good to see you.
You too. Great talk. Oh, sorry. So it's my turn.
Yeah.
It was a very simple question, but you mentioned that cognitive control is difficult to train, and I'm imagining that's cognitive neuroscientists doing those studies. And I often feel like there's this divide between the studies we do in cognitive neuroscience versus what people do out in the field in clinical psychology. And so I'm curious what you think about approaches that people use in clinical psychology to help with cognitive control, and like what can we learn from that about the theory?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm most of the training that I'm talking about are attempts to do things like use these sort of dynamic training, right, in order to improve working memory capacity or improve multitasking ability and things like that. And they're not necessarily done by cognitive neuroscientists. A lot of them are done by psychologists who want to try to improve stuff, and some is marketed by clinical psychologists and others, right, as being a way to improve things ranging from attention to, you name it. And as I review in the book, to this point, the clinical trials that have been done, when they've been done with proper control, active controls and so forth, have not been shown a lot of evidence of things like far transfer and benefits. They show near transfer effects, right? But they don't show a lot of far transfer effects in terms of the how they improve things. And in general, there's not a lot of good ways to kind of improve cognitive control. This also happens in things like stroke rehabilitation. That one of the heart, if you have someone who has because of a stroke, for instance, loses executive function, there's not a lot of there's not a lot of things you can do to restore general cognitive control. Like very often these patients will, they will work for training, but you'll train them task by task, right? It's like they ask them, what's the one, if you could do one thing again, that would make you feel like you're back in control of your life. And they'll say, like, if I could just make my morning oatmeal. So you train them like crazy till they could make their morning oatmeal, right? But they can't really transfer that to, even if it was analogous, let's say the way they make their oatmeal, it's instant oatmeal, and they're boiling water and pouring it into some container with their instant oatmeal. You'd think that having trained that, they would be faster to learn making tea or something because it has some shared components. That's not the case. You have to start from scratch, right? And so it's very hard to restore the general cognitive control ability, just like it's very hard to train it in ways that show kind of lasting and far transfer effects. And it's not to say I don't think one can do it. I think there could be ways to do it. We just haven't really landed on good ones yet that I'm aware of.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and that kind of matches with my view of addiction therapy. Is like, it seems like you want to change the value of the addiction rather than your ability to suppress it or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's a good analogy. Though to be clear, most of what I'm describing is strictly in the realm of like cognitive control. There are other kinds of training interventions that might work for people. And that's fine.
Can I just add a coda to that really nice question? You know, in your section on this, you know, there's one line around where you say, well, unless you could reproduce the first 10 years of childhood, then maybe that would work, right? So do you think that cognitive control when a child learns, is that just tessellating the whole space task by task, and life is sufficiently rich that you simply have enough instantiations that you just cover the space? Or do you think, and you do say somewhere at the end of the book, that maybe more enriched environments might be more general? You know, there's Daphne Bavalier's very interesting work on video games, right, where she's shown that first-person shooter games seem to generalize unexpectedly well. They don't seem to suffer from this curse of task specificity. Are the children really having experiences that are more generalized, or are they just having such rich experiences that they're just tessellating the task space?
Yeah, well, I don't know that they're tessellating it. I mean, I think that, I mean, I do think, so there's two things to say. So I do think variability matters. And so that aspect of what you're saying, I agree. So I think it is the case. It's not just training in a task or one kind of task is going to generalize. I think that if something's going to work, it's probably going to be variable training across lots of tasks, because that's what allows you to abstract. And precisely what you're skeptical about, right? The development's important for building this library of control policies. You know, if you were to buy that idea, it's that you have to abstract these out of lots of tasks, right? You're getting lots of different tasks, and you're learning what are the kind of core components that you can use and reuse effectively, and that requires doing lots of tasks over lots of time. Now, I think you're testing the whole space, not necessarily, and so I actually do think that's why it could be why things like, and that's the speculation in the book, things like enrichment matter, right? Because it could be, again, you can think of like one way to think of it is like the first 10 years of your life to 15 years are treated as a sample, right, of a data set that's supposed to be the model or representative of the rest of your life in terms of the kinds of control policies you have to lay down. And so to the degree that that's a good data set, then you're going to have a good way of you'll be all right. If it's limited, you'll be fine within the limited domain you were in, right? But you'll have, if you move outside of that, you're going to have a harder time. And if wants to push that speculation, as we get older and the world becomes more and more unlike the way it was when our system was developing, then you can imagine that you have a harder and harder time applying the control policies you built to those new kinds of scenarios, precisely because you haven't tested the whole space, you've taken a sample of the space. Right?
Olga, feel free to ask any follow-ups you might have.
I think I just had a brief follow-up, which is that you mentioned that input and output gating and kind of the sequences of what to gate in were very important for these control policies. So I'm wondering if anyone's working on developing interventions specifically in that direction, like literally telling someone when and what to input gate or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I don't know of that. I mean, I do know there's been one follow-up to that experiment that I described that did show evidence of some FAR transfer, in the sense that performance improved on a dissimilar task based on a kind of shared gating policy. Right? In this case, it was task switching after having done the kind of context first type of working memory task that we did. So that's at least one case where you saw some that might be promising in that regard, that you could start trying to find ways to train that. But no, that's not something that's currently been done. Actually, I'm now in discussions. We might actually be involved in some collaborations to start doing things like that, but I don't know.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Good seeing you, Olga.
You too.
Good to see you, Olga. I'll read the next question because I invited the person, but they seem to not be able to connect. So they ask, can it be broadly said that input gates are areas receiving and processing afferent connections, and output gates send to efferent connections?
No, I don't think that it's necessarily strictly it reduces to kind of input output of neurons. I think this is really at the level of a kind of functional level in terms of, strictly speaking, an input gate is something that allows it specifies some, at least the way we define it, some representation in working memory. It puts it in a state such that it'll be accessible at a later point in time. That's its principle, that's its definition. And selective input gating, more particularly, is that it can assign it to a particular address, and that address is accessible later. And an output gate selects that information from that address, and it makes it available. So that's its functional level definition. You can implement that in a number of ways. The way that I favor in the book, right, based on my kind of collaborations with Michael, is actually through a disinhibitory loop. So it's actually through a series of the way that the input and the output gate is happening is actually by a series of inhibitory outputs by neurons, right? And so I think those two aren't necessarily the same.
In a related note from the same person, their second question is the concept of gating present in cortical areas, sensory processing areas, or you think they are also present in subcortical regions and cerebellum?
Also a very good question. I mean, again, there are different models of this, right? So I think in our view, the gate emerges through interactions between subcortical structures, the basal ganglia and the cortex, at least one kind of the gating important for control. Certainly gating as a function can happen in multiple levels and scales, and there's evidence, that, for instance, there are other models of working memory gating. Xiaojing Wang has one based on the operation of interneurons and so forth that are very plausible. And so there are different ways to implement a gate, that, both in cortex as well as through corticostriatal interactions, cerebellum, and so forth.
Elizabeth in the chat is asking a question. Yes, Elizabeth, we will have time to ask, and you can come if you would like to join us on screen. You're also welcome to join on screen. Let me know in the chat if you want to join. Before that, I'm going to read Ayuna's question. They ask, can you please give some insights on cognitive control and metacognition?
Control and metacognition. Okay, so I think there are ways in which control acts as a metacognitive. When people say metacognition, they think about cognition, right? So it can be your estimate of your own ability, your estimate of your likelihood of knowing something, of remembering things, and so forth. Cognitive control certainly relies on those kinds of signals, you would imagine, right? Because it's important for being able to predict outcomes and be able to organize behavior as an estimate of, for instance, the outcome of that behavior. An estimate, people who are interested in value, for instance, are estimating also mental effort and things like that would be involved in particular tasks. And so metacognitive signals are going to be very important for control. And there's also evidence that the patients that struggle with cognitive control also struggle with their metacognition. They tend to have a really hard time estimating, for instance, their ability to remember how many numbers they'll remember. They'll say outrageous things in terms of sometimes way larger numbers than you'd expect and so forth. Now, whether that's, again, a process of the metacognitive signals themselves are disrupted, or that we answer questions like that using the kind of serial reasoning process we were describing earlier, because it's an unusual question to ask. So you have to invent a new way of thinking about it. That's sort of an open question, but it's clear that they struggle in those kinds of metacognitive judgments. So there's a tight relationship, I think.
That's very helpful. Another question that Elizabeth asks is related to that. And if you need a follow-up, please add it either in the chat or in the Ask a Question area. Elizabeth asks, could you reiterate distinction between control and cognitive control? I think when we were talking about some circuits, just neurons can also, the control theory could apply to them, but not all of them are cognitive control. If you could elaborate on that a little.
So, so I think you can define lots of systems as having control in the sense in the control theory sense, right? They can be controllable. They have different types of control, feedback-based control, and so forth. And that'll happen in the level of neurons and all kinds of different systems. What makes something cognitive control, at least as have been discussing it, is that it's where you have a internal representation of a task or rule or knowledge or something that you're using to guide behavior towards that, based on that rule or goal or task, right? That internal representation of a task is very important. And this is sort of getting to, I think, what John was asking earlier about that's presupposed, right? The way by which you come to that knowledge and those goals is, I'm assuming, is sort of there. That's somebody else's problem, some other scientist's problem. And so the question is, for control, is how do we use that to plan, to implement our tasks, to monitor our tasks, and so forth.
So on that note, one of the things that happens at the bedside, as you well know, is you sometimes ask patients to name as many animals as they can in a minute, something like that, right? And you also have a part in the book where people have to name as many states as they can, right?
Right.
And I've done this and you've done it, and you notice that some people will go, okay, you live in New York, you go rat, pigeon, dog, roach, and then you go, where did I last see at the zoo? You find some way to open up another set, right? And I'm just wondering, within your framework, when you see that sort of ratcheting up, animals in New York, zoo, I went on safari once, what did I see on that David Attenborough video? And you do. So where does knowledge to come up with that idea to now switch to David Attenborough documentaries versus the procedure of then itemizing through them? It gets to the heart of my question at the beginning. Where's the boundary in that task between knowing what animals are, thinking about zoos versus cities versus documentaries, then itemizing them and making sure you don't repeat, because that's one of the things you're not allowed to do, right? You mustn't go roach again, right? So is that control plus the presupposed knowledge? Is that a beautiful fusion of the two? That test is often considered, correct me if I'm wrong, some sort of prefrontal test, right? Of how many animals can you name? It's not. So it seems to me to encapsulate more than just the control side, or do you think it can all come under the rubric of control when you ask someone to do that?
Okay, I think it does come in the rubric, but I think you're right. It is a nice example where these things interact. I mean, one clue here, right, is that you have patients, as you know, right, if they're doing it, and you sort of got at this, right, if they're doing a fluency task, right, like you give them category fluency or something, they can stick with one, and they have multiple categories that they can draw, and they might stick with one category too long before switching to the next category, things like that. And too long in the sense that they're not generating many new exemplars, or they're repeating, and they have a hard time shifting to those. And that's an example of not controlling memory in the sense you're not making good estimates about what's going to be fruitful, right? And then adjusting your strategy accordingly as you're retrieving it. Now, in terms of like the gating ideas, right? So one idea, and that's maybe dissatisfying, but one way that the gating could explain that, right, is that we're able to evaluate the products of retrieval and then hold in working memory things we think might be fruitful. So the sort of stream of thought you were describing, right, to the degree that we think it's valuable for the future, right, for future retrieval. So in the stream of thought you were describing, as something comes to mind, right, we gate it into working memory, it foregrounds it in retrieval, and as a result, we start retrieving things that are related to that. The problem with that, why I think that's a bit dissatisfying, is I'm saying that somehow you know that that's valuable, right? Why do you know that? Right, that's going to be valuable or a fruitful thing to hold in working memory. Requires some idea about the semantics. So in that sense, maybe it is a good example of where these two things interact, right? That there has to be, at least at the way it's being at the value evaluation, that this is a valuable cue to hold in mind. Because that's analogous to the idea from the, as you call it, the hydraulic thing, right? That when I encounter a cue or a context that's relevant, right, that because it's valuable, I hold that in working memory. So if I'm doing the Stroop task and I get a task instruction that I know you hold in mind, that's valuable. The reason that, because that's been valuable to my behavior, I put it into working memory, right? It's the same kind of idea, right? But here it's it's a vastness of different potential cues that might relate to memory, and so it can't just be like your experience with that cue that's been valuable. It has to
right. So that's why it's a nice mixture. Right. So it's sort of strooping yourself, right, rather than being given the rule from the outside.
So I'm going to read Elizabeth's follow-up. They say, I presume David considers motor control is a form of cognitive control. I personally, I think depends on what kind of motor control. And then they ask, is there a hierarchy of control in the types of behaviors? Great question.
So I think there are aspects of motor control that I don't think are cognitive control. Very well learned kinds of actions, right, can be very controlled, but they're not controlled through an internal plan or knowledge, right? They can be controlled through the stimulus in the environment through a very well learned task. And there's all kinds of control, motor control, that's adjusting to errors in movement and so forth, that would be characterized as control and wouldn't be cognitive control. But there are aspects of like things you might call motor control that are cognitive in nature. And then in terms of awareness, I do think that there is that's a hard one, because it's always tricky to start thinking about where like things like consciousness and awareness come into play. There is, I think, an idea though that cognitive control depends on an explicit knowledge of what you want, right? Of the rule. You could name it if you're asked about it. I don't think we're always explicitly aware of it, but you have access to it consciously if you needed to describe the overall rule. What I don't think
you're answering Ella's question now, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading.
Yes. So Elizabeth's, the last part of Elizabeth's question was, is there hierarchy of control, different types of control? And Ella's question, which we haven't read, is about the relationship between awareness and cognitive control. So,
I'm answering Ella's question. So just to finish up the answer to Ella's question, I'll come back to Elizabeth's question. And so I think that we aren't aware very often of these kinds of control policies. So we're aware of our goals, and we're aware of rules and things like that, but we aren't aware of those control policies, like the input and output gating kinds of things. I can't describe a task to you in terms of that. Like, well, you need to input this to work in memory. Even if I had the language, right, it's very hard for me to have access to that in terms of awareness, whereas I do have access to my rules. Okay, sorry. And coming back to Liz's question of hierarchy, yes, I do think there's a hierarchy of control, because control has to be, our behavior is hierarchical in some sense. We have goals and sub-goals and so forth, and the control system needs to contend with that. There's some debate, though, about how the control system solves that hierarchical problem. But in my view, yes, it's hierarchical. And I think it's very closely tied to the motor system, because I think it develops out of the mechanisms develop out of the motor system.
Thank you. That was super helpful. Please, everyone, feel free to add your follow-up questions while I ask 2 more questions that I had left from my part. So I'm just going to briefly say what those questions are. So one is about the contentions and bridges to John Donkin's theory, and that kind of more unindividuated, I guess, idea of different parts of the prefrontal function. But the other thing that I wanted to ask, and I'm going to start with this one, is that currently Bo-Ann, who's a grad student who's finishing up at Yale in history and philosophy, or I think history of science, but I'm not sure, maybe history and philosophy of science, is doing an internship with us at Microsoft Research, working on the early behaviorist ideas that influenced machine learning and reinforcement learning, and the cognitivist opposition to those ideas of Watson and Thorndike, and various others that were within the same era, that believed there was nothing inside, so to speak. They were thinking about controlling behavior of others by keeping them hungry and then giving them the reinforcement only when they did the right thing, but not when they do the wrong thing. And then others even giving them negative reinforcement when they do the wrong thing. And the idea then was, if an agent does trial and error and it's hungry and only receives reinforcement, it's going to learn only those things that is going to lead to reinforcement. So it was this very diminished idea of humans, rodents, and it's interesting the kinds of those kinds of creatures they would test on. It wasn't just rodents and animals and dogs. It was also orphan children. It was also their idea that people who are colonized are also similar, that they would be able to control them. So their motivation ideologically seems to come from the idea of controlling others. And then on the other hand, you read Tolman, who famously opposed this idea of behaviorism. Tolman opposed it because Tolman said there is something there is a representation inside, and that representation is capable of resisting your notions of control, or it's capable of understanding the world and building a model of it. And it doesn't just learn what you feed it to learn, it learns a lot of things. And latent learning experiments on rodents showed that even rodents were capable of this kind of cognitive maps, which Tolman named. And I think first he introduced these ideas in early 1920s, and then by 1948 he wrote that review paper that we all know, Cognitive Maps in Rats and Man. And something that is very interesting is the ideological underpinnings of these two traditions, both of which have influenced machine learning that as we have it today. One of them says it's all trial and error and some reward maximization. It's very close to this paper that came out, reward is enough. The other one said no, representation learning and the way that these representations lead to generative kind of sequences in exploration, even in sparse rewards or no rewards environments, are important. And it's interesting, both of them have shaped machine learning. There you can find machine learning that's very Watsonian and very Thorndikean, and you can find machine learning that's more Tolmanian in some sense. But I think we are lacking machine learning that's more, cognitive control oriented to the extent that we do it. It's always like, it's very interesting. We are usually technically behind the machine learning by 10 years, but they are usually behind us by a couple of decades in terms of what they have addressed. So with that long introduction, what I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned something that I think I hadn't noticed, which was that the Miller-Pribram-Galanter book was behaviorist. So I was wondering, you said respond. Okay, good.
Because it was rejecting behaviorism. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Now okay. This completely solved my mental landscape, because for a second I was thrown up. I was like, what happened? Like, okay, good. Okay, so
it has a wonderful discussion of it. I mean, it really discusses why it's limited and it can't account for the plan and the gap between knowledge and action. And he does Miller, who's a wonderful writer, by the way, in general, is a good reason to read.
Exactly.
Writing, right? I forgot the old expression was that Miller wrote it, Pribram read it, and Galanter understood it, or something. That was the joke.
That's the thing about the book.
Yeah, but at any rate, but I think he highlights, he calls it, it's sort of an optimistic approach is what he describes behaviorism. But he points out that it has no way, it's bereft of explaining things like planning and foresight and so forth. And so cognitive control is really, but there's no place for cognitive control within that theoretical framework. And your example of like the humans, it reminds me, there was this great, wonderful short story that was written in the 1950s, actually, the heyday of behaviorism, about a human who gets kidnapped to some planet somewhere and wakes up in this cage, right? And is basically subjected, over the course of this story, is subjected to what amount to behaviorist experiments. And he catches on, he realizes after a while what his experimenters want from him. So he starts then acting in the ways, and then he tries to show how he understands what they want, and he tries to act deliberately in other kinds of ways. And they decide that he doesn't really match their theory, and so it doesn't end well for him.
Who wrote that story?
I forget the author. If I'll try to find it.
Please, that's amazing. And you said this was written in when?
In like the 50s. It was
that's amazing.
Science fiction short story, but it's
it reminds me a little bit of the sort of strange rodentization of humans that we've written about, that you do lots of lever pressing tasks in the rodent, and then you talk about reward evaluation. You come to humans and they don't do reward evaluation. Right? It doesn't happen, right? And go, wow, what's going on, right? And so there's basically, because there are other ways to cognitively control and not do it, right?
Exactly.
Get it, just like the man in the cave, right? And so I think it's this. And I was just reading something recently where somebody writing in a paper ratchets almost with whiplash speed between a human example and then an animal example without telling you that they've switched species.
Yeah.
Right. And as if you can do that and use the same analogies and tasks, and it's dangerous, right? In other words, and in the case of the man, you get it so well that you become the ultimate behaviorist. You do exactly what the experimenter wants.
Exactly. But you're controlling yourself to do it, right?
You're controlling yourself to do it, right? Exactly. Yeah, I'm going to be very intelligent and acting dumb.
Exactly.
Right.
So I have a question that maybe both of you can have some insights about. I think we have managed to get Tolmanian kind of discoveries in machine learning. I don't think we have yet managed to get the Miller, Galanter, Pribram type, or David's kind of work, or even my type of work entirely into machine learning, in that there are some advancements here and there, and the transformers attention modules and like stacking multiple transformers on top of each other. Some of the work that Anirudh Goyal has been doing with Yoshua Bengio, it gets somewhat, but not quite there, in that this way of describing a higher order task and the agent being able to apply it to multiple places with zero shot without language being involved, just by, it's very interesting to me that that has not been as successful. What do you think, in your perspective of what you see from the deep learning, machine learning, reinforcement learning community, what do you think could be added for this to become like one of the approaches, or become more of one of the approaches that they can cover? And again, in the history, they started with trial and error learning only. And in fact, Clark Hall was the first person, as far as we know, and if you know someone earlier, please let us know, we will include it in the paper, was the first person to apply these kinds of behaviorist ideas into machines, or believe that this could be applied. And then Turing does it, and a lot of others talk about it. I wonder when this idea came to people's minds that machines could learn like biological creatures. And then there was a shift from just trial and error learning and reinforcement into them having representations and cognitive maps. But the complete shift, and there is this notion of planning, but it's very different. It's a very specific kind of planning. It has to be sequences in an environment I've seen. It's a very specific notion of planning. To go to this more abstract task set, like schema type of ideas that you can generate on the spot hierarchical plans in environments you have never seen before and become successful completely, like the airport example, we don't have like that for robots or for agents. What do you think is missing, or what do you think might be the kinds of elements of your work or our field that you think has not been present in what you see of AI work?
Well, that's a really hard question. I don't know AI well enough to tell you, because my bet is anything I offer, you'll say, oh no, someone tried that. But I mean, I guess at a really high level, I don't know if the ingredients are there in terms of what the pressure to learn things. John mentioned the example earlier that when a human learns a task, even if we don't need to represent its structure compositionally, we do. So something with the way we learn, I think the way we structure task representations really matter. Right, and we are able to sort of render them in terms of these low-dimensional components, right? That are low-dimensional in the sense that we can abstract them to new situations, right? Or even if details don't match perfectly, we can make predictions about how if they are assembled in a novel way, they can yield a new output. And so, and that is something that has happened from the first example of learning, and you have to be able to learn across multiple different tasks without having catastrophic interference. So it's both of those things. You learn in terms of those components, and then you do that for many, many different tasks. And at least if you're interested in building an agent that can be general in its intelligent behavior, seems at least one important component. Another might be really this thing we keep going back to is where the interaction is between knowledge, what we know, the content of these representations, and the sort of symbol operations we need to be able to order them in a useful way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there seems to be just one, we've discussed this at length at the Salon, that we just seem to have this, whether it's structure or meaning, we just seem to layer this organization onto the world that in its compressed form helps us plan and reason, right? Mm-hmm. It's a format, as you say, that then has to be operated upon, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, but we seem to be able to get things into a unique human flavored format for subsequent operation. And we just don't know how we get that particular format, right? And it's missing, right? We can tell stories about anything, it seems.
That's right.
Yeah.
You can act on them, right?
And then we can act on them.
And that's the other piece, right, that I think.
Yeah, you can tell a story about almost anything and then act on it.
Right, efficiently. Right. Because we also represent those structures.
Yeah, it goes from a story to a plot. Yes. So where next, David? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you...
Wait, I have a thing about that. So that relates somehow to my other question. You mentioned the structuring of the tasks matters a lot. I couldn't agree with you more. I think architecture matters too, like a more PFC, like that allows for that structure to happen. And the reason that I'm saying that is because I was saying earlier during the green screen that green room, which that training one GPT-3 right now takes as much carbon footprint of driving a car to the moon and back. And then after the training is done, about 40% to 50% of the network, depending on the pruning analysis and the way that it was built or what it was trained on, is useless. It's just not helpful anymore. And that's a huge amount. And why was it needed? The particular architecture that they have built required twice its capacity to learn things and then afterwards not use it. So it's very sparse afterwards. Right. But you can't, if you condense it from the beginning with the current architecture, it can't learn the same things. And if something has the carbon footprint of driving to the moon and back, cutting it by half or 40% is a huge deal, I think, for the planet and for a lot of reasons. So I wonder how you think the architecture of the prefrontal cortex and these ways of structuring relates to the different subdivisions maybe of the prefrontal cortex. And I want to sneak in two questions here. And how do you think this relates to, let's say, John Duncan's ideas of a little bit more domain general, as opposed to maybe certain kinds of components interacting and taking more specialized roles in the PSC? So that's a two question. One is related to the John Duncan thing, and the other thing is how can that division inspire better architectures that are less wasteful in machine learning?
Yeah, I mean, again, the second one's very hard. I think I'll start with the question about John. So, I mean, actually, I think a lot of what he discusses is very in line with what I think in the following way. He talks about these sort of attentional units, right, that have to be sequenced out to do hard tasks, right? And those attentional units sound a great deal, and he's even said this, sound a great deal like the kinds of gating operations that I'm describing and Michael describes and others. So I think that's I think there's a commonality in the idea that there's a core component to control that involves the ability to regulate what information is being accessed when conditionally. I think is kind of sort of in common. Whether you call that an attentional episode or gating operation, what have you. I do think in terms of at the neural level, we differ in the sense that he's really focused on, or he's argued that the prefrontal cortex has great capacity for doing this, but there's not important sort of functional subdivisions in that part of the brain. And we think that there's evidence that there is heterogeneity, and one way of understanding that heterogeneity is in terms of the abstraction over these kinds of gating policies, right? Particularly as one goes from motor cortex up towards the mid-lateral prefrontal cortex. Now, is there and that's I think that's a matter of discussion and debate still. It's a hard debate to ever resolve because as I think. One thing that's clear is that the prefrontal cortex is very context sensitive, and so it's really hard to show these like strong kind of general principles across lots of different tasks very often, and so you end up it's very easy to kind of collapse towards it's all the same kind of theory. It's very hard to find distinctions that hold up in every case because we just don't understand the tasks well enough to align them across different cases, and that's been a consistent issue for resolving that debate. In terms of what are the lessons for networks, I don't know yet that we understand the way the prefrontal cortex represent tasks well enough to be able to answer that. I think, and maybe I sound like John was about to ask me like what's next or what I think is next, and maybe this is kind of going to answer that. I think so. I've gotten very interested in this about the structure, the geometry of the neural representations of tasks. In particular, I've been interested in the fact that what we've been talking about almost throughout this, right, is the advantage of what you might think of as low-dimensional representations, right? That cast away, that abstract over detail, and and that are components of tasks that then you could kind of take out of that task and put into lots of different tasks. But it does seem there's growing evidence that the brain also has these representations that are arguably dimensional and not compositional in that way. That actually are integrated. They're kind of like almost like a think of like in pattern separation, right? It's the specific task episode, it's this combination of rule and stimulus and response and so forth that is unique, and it's very separated from all these other from a very similar situation where only one element changes, and the brain also has those kind of representations, including the prefrontal cortex. And so we've been very interested in this because it's possible that may have as much as low dimensional kind of compositional representations have their advantages in terms of being able to assemble them into new tasks. There could be advantages to these kinds of highly separated representations, in that they may help with efficient control. If you think about, the example I gave in my little opening, right, where I was saying you have the exact same input, right, but one contextual feature is different, you have to do a totally different behavior. Well, if you can represent that as a very different representation, where there's no overlap in these two scenarios, even though the input space is highly overlapping, that may help with issues of interference and the kinds of obstacles to multitasking and interference within the system that come along with having low dimensional representations. And so we've gotten very interested then in how, under what circumstances, right, the brain is representing tasks in these different ways, and what their advantages are for behavior. And we're just at the beginning of this, right? But there's a lot of, in my mind, it's changing a lot of the way I'm thinking about this, because even, in the book, I'm really never talk about things in that integrated way. And the fact, if that's a feature of our system, it's an interesting question for me as a scientist about why and what it's doing. So it's that's in terms of what's next, that's what I'm excited about. Stay tuned what it means.
Yeah, I mean, following up on that was one thing that I didn't quite understand. You mention it in several places in the book, where you say the more, low-dimensional, compressed, abstract the representation, the higher likelihood there is of interference. I don't know why that follows. I don't remember a particular example that you gave where the interference was a function of the level of abstraction. You said it many times, but I could never find the proof of it. What was the proof?
That's a good question. So I think it's not so much that abstract representations have to be subject to interference. The question is, if something is used by multiple tasks, right, then it can be, what causes interference between two tasks has been a big question for a number of years. And one of the
I mean, I've been involved in those debates a lot.
Yeah. One idea is that it's reliance on a common resource, right, some common representation, right. And so, I mean, the analogy to that, it would be, there's different ways of describing it, right. I think I give this in the book as well, is if you imagine, a road system, right. So if I think of a task as a route driven between two locations, right? So one very inefficient way to build your roads would be to build a separate road from every spot in town to every other spot in town. It's a very high dimensional road system, zero traffic, right? As long as all these roads could have separate their own elevation, so there's no intersections, and you have an express route to every place in town. It'd be incredibly expensive, awful in terms of the way the town would look, but zero traffic. But of course we don't do that. Rather, we build lower dimensional systems that have highways and common main streets and roads but allow us to build any route on fewer numbers of roads, right, than the number of routes we can build, because we can use those low dimensional representations, right, to build that structure. But the problem is, because they're in common, you're going to have things like traffic where multiple cars rely on the same route. And so that's the intuition behind that claim. That being said, I sort of agree with you that we need evidence of that, right?
I think
there are attempts to test that in the multitasking and dual tasking literature already, and we're interested in doing that too in this line of work.
Yeah, it seems like, to me, I get the road one. It just seemed that was more of a metaphor. That there was a metaphorical leap to calling more abstract notions the shared junctions, but I couldn't quite work it out. I'd like to have an example like the road example with an abstraction.
But actually something that's
well, the road example is very low level, right? It's just that you share a traffic light or you share a T-junction, right? So, but what's the analogous cognitive version of that, where I could get the same intuition of the abstraction working like a shared traffic light or a roundabout?
Well, I mean, the cognitive level, I could discuss it in terms of if it's color, for instance, that I need for these two different tasks, or if it's some mapping, then I have one task is using that at a given time, the other can't, for instance, would be sort of the idea of an overlap. But what that means in terms of the implementation of those tasks, I agree with you. I don't have a good answer for that. And I don't know if it's been demonstrated. I don't know of evidence of it either, right? There's clear evidence that kind of overlap.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There is something though, because so for instance, if I am currently, so when there is some work that I think you guys just hired Sebastian, right? Sebastian Muslik had done at Princeton with John Cohen, and the work concerned the extent to which when you're learning in multiple tasks, whether it's helpful for you to have shared resources with them, and at some point it becomes helpful to just not have these componential representations, but actually form a joint representation for both of them that constantly supports both of them.
Yeah.
And what he showed was that, John, if you learn the two tasks separately and then try to multitask with them at the same time, it's more challenging because there is a lot of shared resources that get messed up. And there was a better performance after a while when the network started to have one joint representation that included both of them. If I understand, if I remember
the opposite, because
multitasking.
David had an example that went in the opposite direction, I thought, which is over time you separate the configurations.
That's not the case for the multitasking one. This is a case where imagine if you are singing and playing the guitar at the same time. If you only practice singing separately and playing the guitar separately, the moment where you want to put them together, I don't know if you've tried. The first time that you try putting them together, it's a mess. But if you practice them together all the time, the idea is that there will be exactly a separation again. There will be a separated new representation that's for doing them both together. That's not just using those two components separately. Does that make sense, John? So it's a little different.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I get your version. I just think that the version where David talks about training on multitasking, and I thought that you were making the claim in the book, and I may be misremembering, David, that you actually begin to separate the representations so there isn't a bottleneck between them. Isn't that something
that's right? But it's in line with the sorts of things that Sebastian was showing, in the sense that one thing he was showing is when you have the larger your net, if you expand your network so you can have more separated pathways, you improve your multitasking, right? But you're slower to learn new tasks, right? Because you can't. In that example, if I remember it exactly, we should ask.
While we're on multitasking,
but it's at least the network is. Because of the ability to separate those pathways. And so but the multitasking example, is you start learning that as a unique combination, and that allows you to separate from the other ones.
Does that make sense, John? It's still a separation, but it's a separate pathway that's for both of them, instead of having two pathways that is for each of the tasks that you're always using those two components. After a while, you create a separate pathway for the combination.
It's I get it. I get it. You have a separate pathway that does have two components, but in its totality, it's separate from each one on its own.
I have a good analogy for you, that because you really are great at visual analogies, or analogies that are everyday that people remember. I'm learning from you. So imagine you have a friend, you have two different friends, you love them both. All of a sudden, they start dating. And then when you hang out with them, you realize it's a different entity you're dealing with than when you're hanging out with each of them individually. Mm-hmm. It's very similar to that. Mm-hmm. There is a separate representation that's the separate representation of the couple together. And there's a separate representation for each of those individuals. So there's three separate representations now. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, and I wanted to say, it does. That's great, actually, and it's so true. On multitasking, in your section on multitasking, David, I just had a more detailed question. You talk about, and I've been very interested in this too. You talk about three things, as far as I can tell. There's, the echo of the last thing you did at the switch. You call it an echo, which I agree with. Mm-hmm. Then you talk about the reconfiguration cost. Mm-hmm. But how do you disambiguate just the fact that there's a cost to each task? Because when you're foveating on one task, you're not foveating on the other, right? You're alternating. So you're going to deteriorate with respect to both, because you spend less total time foveating on each task when you're doing both. But I couldn't tell how you disambiguate just time away foveating on the other as you alternate, and the reconfiguration cost. I get the echo cost. I agree with that, but I couldn't see how you disambiguate just sharing foveation time as you
I understand the foveating bit though. So the idea is that there's a sort of a decay. So if I'm like have no decay, if I have a process that just, let's say I had a perfect, there's no interference, right? And I can switch without cost between these two tasks. So I'm moving along. Someone just asked me if I could explain the concept for the audience. I'm not sure which concept we're talking about.
Oh, the concepts that John was saying, that was me. I was saying that John mentioned these things very fast. Some of the people who are watching might not remember that chapter of your book right now. So if you could explain the task switching, the echo, and the configuration cost.
Okay, so backing up, so that it's been a long observation that anytime you're alternating tasks, right? If I have two tasks that I'm doing, and I did all of one task and then all of the other task, and I time how long it takes me to do those versus I do one task and then the other one in alternation, it's going to take me longer to complete both tasks in the alternating version than the one in which I did all of one and then all the other. And you can see that even at the level of individual events with each, it'll take me longer, I'll have worse performance, and that's called a switch cost. And there's been a long debate about the source of that switch cost. Why do we have these behavioral costs? And one idea is, and these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but one idea is that there's a cost to kind of this echo, or the idea that when you do one task and you leave it to do another task, there's interference because of the lingering effects of that task. And they can be elicited in any number of ways, including just sharing a number of common cues with the current task you're in. So it doesn't even have to be you just did that other task, right? You can elicit these costs by sort of co-activating these two tasks with each other. The other idea, and this is the older idea, is it's a reconfiguration cost. The oldest version of that was very much like a finite state assumption. I think as I'm in task A as one state, and then I have to go to task B, and that gear shift takes time, right? And so that's the switch cost is associated with that. And there's been long debate about the degree to which each of these contributes. A lot of what I spent time on in the book is that kind of echo cost. I give some, I mentioned the reconfiguration cost because that's the ability to retrieve the stuff you need for this new task and so forth. All of that is relevant, but I do think interference is a major cause of these costs. Now, in terms of so then I think what John was asking though is that there's your time away. So if I'm spending time on this task, I'm not spending it on that one, and so perhaps my degraded performance also is because I'm not spending time on the other task. But if I'm understanding what you're saying, that assumes there must be some degradation. In other words, I can't just hold my position on this task. If I had two tasks and I could do perfect switching without any interference, and they were just sort of, as I'm going, I want to reach this level, so I do this task, I switch to that one for a while, then I go to this one, and so forth.
Yeah, but in the same unit time, you won't go as far because you've done fewer trials with attention.
Oh, the same overall time, you mean?
Yeah. If you do the same overall time, you'll be inferior at the end because you spent less attention.
Like my example at the beginning, that matters, but that doesn't explain the trial switch costs, right? That exist, right? That you still experience.
No, right. I guess yes. In other words, just so I understand, in order to get to the echo and the configuration, you have to get down to a cross trial by trial degradation. It can't just be the overall finding that if you do two tasks together, the level you reach in both is less than if you just did each trial, because that's just attentional time on task, right? So you have to dig down a little deeper and go, there's more to it than that, because you get effects at the intertrial interval, trial n and trial n plus 1, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, listen, it's 6:30. I think we've probably bombarded you, David. You've been really game, I have to say.
It's amazing, yeah.
Right.
It's been so much fun. I really enjoyed it. It's great.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Very enjoyable. And yeah, we'd love to, just very selfishly, I think it would be great to have you attend a lab meeting and see some of the stopping, switching, habit, automaticity stuff, because it's
definitely.
Adrian Hayes has done some really good work where you show that if you play with time a lot, you can unmask a lot of these processes. And I think it's really very interesting, that one can do that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's set it up.
Can I finish with an anecdote? I had something very funny happen to me today.
Absolutely.
I was walking to get a haircut, and I got to the crossing, and there was a man in his car with his window open, a very conventional, white executive kind of guy, screaming at the top of his lungs to Mark Almond's gay song "Tainted Love," just singing along to it really loudly. And I thought to myself, appearances can be deceiving, or he doesn't know what song he's actually singing along to. And I realized that if I had to choose between those two, I think I'd pick the latter. I don't think he quite knew what that song is about. And I just thought to myself, life can be very funny. Anyway, I hope you don't mind that anecdote.
I like your interpretation.
All right.
Thank
well, thank
you
you
so
everyone.
much, David. And thank you, John, for the great questions. Thank you, everyone who asked questions. Thank you, Olga and Elizabeth and Ella. This was amazing. I will probably, bug you in the future more about these kinds of concepts. It was a great discussion.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Happy
Guys,
summer.
See you guys
Ciao.
for the next session with Anna Shapiro.
Yes.
Don't forget to join us. And also then with Boris Skotkin about homeostatic reinforcement learning. So we're going to have very interesting 2 upcoming sessions.
All right.
Ciao. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.